Tony Stark had built technology that bent physics, armors that could withstand nuclear strikes, and reactors that generated more power than most small nations consumed. He traveled through time, fought aliens across the cosmos, and survived being chest-deep in a star. But nothing in his considerable experience had prepared him for the moment his experimental dimensional scanner, designed to map parallel universes for potential threats, decided to make him part of the experiment. The malfunction happened 3 seconds into the first test. The scanner's energy signature resonated with something it shouldn't have been able to detect, a tear in space-time that existed in a frequency Jarvis's sensors couldn't classify. One moment Tony was in his lab, making sarcastic comments about quantum mechanics. The next, he was falling through layers of reality that his armor's sensors registered as error, physics undefined. When he emerged, it was with enough velocity that even his inertial dampener struggled. He tumbled through space, actual space, the vacuum kind, his heads-up display throwing warnings faster than he could process. No Earth, no sun he recognized, no familiar constellations, just an ocean of stars that stretched in configurations his astronomy databases couldn't match. JARVIS, status report, Tony said, forcing calm into his voice despite the adrenaline spike his biomonitors were flagging. Armor integrity at 100%, sir, the AI responded with its usual British composure. However, I'm unable to establish any recognizable stellar reference points. We are not in Kansas anymore. We may not even be in the correct universe. That's less than ideal. Tony stabilized his flight, armor systems compensating automatically. Can you get me back? Negative, sir. The dimensional breach we traversed has collapsed. I'm detecting no similar energy signatures within sensor range. We appear to be stranded. Tony floated in the void, his engineer's mind already working through the problem. Stranded in an unknown universe with no way home was bad. Stranded in space with limited life support was worse. But before panic could fully set in, his sensors detected something massive approaching. It was a ship, but calling it merely a ship was like calling the sun merely warm. The vessel was Gothic architecture made mobile, a cathedral the size of a mountain range, adorned with statues of eagles and skulls, bristling with weapon batteries that could level cities. Its hull bore symbols Tony's database couldn't identify, and it moved with purpose that suggested his arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. Sir, that vessel is targeting us, JARVIS reported. Weapons charging, multiple lance batteries, macro cannons, and what appear to be fighter launch bays opening. Recommend immediate evasive action. Hold on that. Tony transmitted on every frequency his armor could generate. Radio, laser communication, quantum entanglement protocols, even Morse code and visible light. This is Tony Stark. I'm not hostile. Repeat, not hostile. I'm just very, very lost. If anyone's receiving this, I'd really appreciate not being shot at today. For 10 seconds, that felt like hours. Nothing happened. Then a response came through. Audio only, heavily accented. Speaking a language Tony shouldn't have understood, but somehow did. His armor's translation protocols working overtime to parse syntax that seemed designed to be simultaneously grandiose and threatening. Unknown vessel, you have violated Imperial space during the Great Crusade of the Emperor of Mankind. Identify your origin, your allegiance, and your technology. Failure to comply will result in immediate destruction. The Omnissiah's servants do not tolerate Xenos infiltration. Okay, several things to unpack there, Tony replied, his mind already cataloging information. Emperor, Crusade, Omnissiah, Xenos. This wasn't just another universe. This was a civilization with very specific views about outsiders. First, not a vessel, I'm a person in a suit. Second, I'm human. Definitely not Xenos, whatever that means. Third, I'm from Earth, though apparently a different Earth than yours. And fourth, I really don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to figure out where I am and how to get home. Another pause, then. You claim to be human. You will be tested. Maintain your current position and await boarding craft. Any attempt to flee or resist will be interpreted as hostile action. The mechanicum of Mars will determine your nature. If you are found to be abomination or Xenos in disguise, you will be destroyed. If you are truly human, you will be integrated into the Emperor's service. There are no other options. The transmission cut off, and Tony watched as smaller craft, each one still larger than a jumbo jet, launched from the massive ship. They were brutalist in design, all sharp angles and weapon mounts. And they surrounded him with the precision of a military force that had done this many, many times before. JORVIS analysis. Sir, based on their technology, language patterns, and philosophical indicators, I believe we've encountered a human civilization that has developed along radically different lines than our own. Their technology appears to be approximately equivalent to ours in some areas, superior in others, particularly in scale, but inferior in miniaturization and efficiency. However, their apparent religious devotion to technology itself is concerning. Religious devotion to technology? Tony's eyebrows rose inside his helmet. That's a new one. Indeed, sir. They referred to the omniscience, a term that combines omniscient and messiah. They appear to worship technology rather than simply use it. This may present complications given your tendency to modify, improve, and innovate. The boarding craft had formed a perfect sphere around him, weapons trained but not firing. Tony could have tried to break through. His armor was fast, his repulsors were charged, and he'd faced worse odds. But something stopped him. Curiosity, maybe, or the realization that if this was a human civilization, he might have just found potential allies in whatever universe he'd landed in. All right, Tony said, raising his hands in the universal gesture of surrender. Let's go meet the neighbors. But if they try to dissect me, I'm filing a very strongly worded complaint. The boarding craft escorted him to the massive vessel, which he learned was called an Arc Mechanicus, a forged ship of Mars dedicated to the quest for lost technology and knowledge. As his armor's sensors swept the ship during docking procedures, JARVIS compiled data that made Tony's engineer heart sink and race simultaneously. This civilization had faster-than-light travel, energy shields, and weapons that could crack planets. But they also had technology that looked like it had been designed in a nightmare. All skulls and brass fittings and religious iconography welded to machine components. And from what his sensors detected, they lobotomized humans and grafted them to machinery as servitors, turning people into organic computers. JRVIS, please tell me I'm misreading those biosigns. I'm afraid not, sir. This civilization appears to practice what can only be described as techno-barbarism, advanced technology combined with deeply regressive social practices. I'm detecting approximately 15,000 humans aboard this vessel, of which 70% show signs of extensive cybernetic modification. Of those, 40% appear to have had their higher brain functions deliberately damaged or removed. Tony felt his stomach turn. He'd seen a lot in his time as Iron Man: alien invasions, killer robots, cosmic threats that defied understanding. But this was different. This was humans doing it to other humans, systematically, as part of their normal operation. Sir, we're being directed to a docking bay. I recommend caution. Whatever this civilization is, it operates on principles radically different from our own. Tony descended into the docking bay, his armor settling on deck plating that had been carved with prayers in a language his translator struggled to parse. Around him, red-robed figures emerged from the shadows. Humans, but altered, their bodies more machine than flesh, eyes replaced with glowing optics, limbs replaced with mechanical appendages that whirred and clicked with each movement. At the center of the group stood a figure whose body was almost entirely mechanical, a tech priest of the Mechanicum, his remaining flesh mostly confined to his head, which was itself augmented with so many implants that determining where human ended and machine began was impossible. I am Fabricator Locum Archenland, the figure said, voice synthesized through Vox speakers that turned it into something between human speech and machine code. You have been identified as human baseline, unmodified, bearing technology of unknown origin. You will submit to examination. You will explain your presence. You will surrender your secrets to the Omniscience servants. This is not negotiable. Tony's faceplate retracted, revealing his face, partly because open communication tended to work better when people could see expressions, partly because he refused to be intimidated by someone who looked like they'd raided a Best Buy and a horror movie set simultaneously. "Tony Stark," he said, extending a hand that no one took. "Engineer, inventor, and apparently your universe's newest arrival. I'd love to explain everything, but I've got a policy about submitting to examinations from people I just met. How about we start with you telling me where I am, what year it is, and why your ship has so many skulls on it?" Seriously, the skull thing is really excessive. Archenland's optical implants focused on Tony with an intensity that suggested complex calculations occurring behind those mechanical eyes. You display irreverence toward the Omnissiah's sacred forms. You mock the machine spirits that govern our vessels. You refuse to submit to proper protocols. These are indicators of either profound ignorance or heretical thought patterns. Or, Tony countered, indicators that I'm from a place where we don't treat technology like a religion and where human rights exist. Look, I get that we've gotten off on the wrong foot here, but I'm a reasonable guy. You want to understand my tech? Fine, I want to understand yours. Let's trade information like civilized people instead of doing the whole submit or be destroyed thing. I've found that approach rarely ends well for anyone. The tech priests surrounding them chittered in binary. Actual binary, their machine components communicating in ones and zeros that Joarvis was frantically trying to decode. Archenland raised a mechadendrite, a mechanical tentacle extending from his back, and the chittering stopped. You speak of trade, of information exchange, of mutual understanding. The fabricator locum tilted his head, servos whirring. These concepts are not heretical in themselves. The quest for knowledge is sacred to the Omnissiah, but your technology violates multiple established principles. You possess what appears to be artificial intelligence, abominable intelligence, forbidden since the dark age of technology. You wear armor that should not function by any understood principle. And your power source, his sensors focused on Tony's chest, where the arc reactor glowed faintly through the armor. Your power source is impossible. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. "Impossible is my specialty," Tony said with the confidence of someone who'd built something better than impossible more times than he could count. And that's where you and I are going to have a fascinating conversation about what's possible, what's forbidden, and why your entire civilization might be doing technology wrong. The tech priest chittering increased in volume and intensity, and Tony got the distinct impression he just said something that was either going to get him killed or make him very, very interesting to these people. Possibly both. The examination chamber was less laboratory and more cathedral with too many dissection tables. Tony stood in the center of the vaulted space, his armor still active, but his weapon systems on standby, while dozens of tech priests circled him like mechanical vultures examining potential prey. Incense burners shaped like skulls wafted smoke that his filters identified as containing trace amounts of actual machine oil. They were literally burning refined petroleum as part of their religious rituals. "This is the most uncomfortable science experiment I've ever been part of," Tony muttered to Jarvis through his neural link. "And I once had to let Bruce Banner scan me for gamma radiation while I was hungover. Sir, I'm detecting increased agitation in their binary communications," Jarvis replied. "They appear to be debating whether you're a miracle or an abomination. The vote is currently split approximately 60-40 in favor of abomination." "Great. Love being the underdog." Fabricator Locum Archenland approached with a device that looked like someone had welded a bunch of sensors to a sensor and called it a day. "You will now submit to scanning. The Omnissiah's instruments will determine the nature of your technology. Remain motionless. Resistance will be met with force." "Or," Tony suggested, "I could just explain it to you. Save us both some time. I'm very good at presentations. I've got charts, diagrams. Well, Jarvis has them. Would you like to see how arc reactor technology works? It's actually fascinating. Miniaturized fusion reaction, self-sustaining, clean energy, Nobel Prize-worthy, if I hadn't already turned those down. Your hubris is noted, Arkan replied, his scanning device beginning to emit sounds that Tony's audio sensors identified as ranging from ultrasonic pings to what might have been Gregorian chants encoded in electromagnetic pulses. But the Omnissiah's wisdom supersedes mortal explanation. The machine spirits will reveal truth. Tony watched as the scans completed, displayed on brass and bronze monitors that looked like someone from the 1800s had designed computer screens. The tech priests examining the readouts began chittering faster, their binary growing more agitated. Impossible, one declared, speaking in Gothic instead of binary. The power source shows no connection to plasma containment protocols, no Prometheum fuel systems, no connection to the warp. It simply generates energy from matter fusion at scales that violate the Omnissiah's established limitations on miniaturization. It's not impossible, Tony said, unable to help himself from defending his work. It's engineering, good engineering. You take deuterium, you compress it, you manage the fusion reaction with magnetic containment, and you get clean, sustainable power. The miniaturization is the hard part, but once you solve the heresy, another tech priest interrupted, you speak of innovation, of invention, of creating new technology rather than recovering lost STC patterns. This is tech heresy of the highest order. Tony blinked. I'm sorry, tech heresy? You're telling me that inventing things is against your religion? All true knowledge was gifted to humanity during the dark age of technology, Arkan Land explained with the patience of someone reciting doctrine to a particularly slow student. The standard template construct systems contained all necessary information for human civilization to thrive. Our sacred duty is to recover lost STC fragments, to maintain existing technology, and to appease the machine spirits that inhabit our sacred devices. To claim to invent, to suggest that mortal understanding could exceed the Omnissiah's perfection, this is the sin of pride made manifest. Tony stared at him, his engineer's brain struggling to process what he was hearing. You're saying your entire civilization is based on not inventing things, on just finding old blueprints and following them exactly, never improving, never iterating, never asking, what if we did it better? Correct. Innovation without sanction leads to abominable intelligence, to technology that rebels against its creators, to the horrors that nearly destroyed humanity during Old Night. We have learned this lesson in blood and ash. We do not repeat the mistakes of our ancestors. Tony searched for words. That's the most backwards, self-defeating, scientifically bankrupt philosophy I've ever heard. And I once had a debate with a flat earther. You're telling me you've had thousands of years to advance your technology, and instead you've spent it looking for instruction manuals. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. Every tech priest turned toward Tony, their optical implants glowing with what might have been anger, might have been calculation, might have been religious fervor. It was hard to tell with people whose faces were mostly machines. You blaspheme, Arkan said quietly, which somehow made it more threatening than if he'd shouted. You insult the Omnissiah's wisdom. You mock the quest for knowledge that has sustained humanity through the long night. You suggest that your understanding, the understanding of one mortal man from an unknown world, exceeds 10 millennia of accumulated wisdom and doctrine. Yeah, Tony replied, because he'd never been good at backing down even when it was tactically smart. I kind of am, because your doctrine is choking you. Look at your technology, it's impressive, sure. You've got FTL, you've got energy weapons, you've got ships that make my armor look like a toy, but you're building everything like it's a religious artifact instead of a tool. Those servitors outside, you're lobotomizing people to make biological computers when actual AI could do the job better, faster, and without the whole crimes against humanity aspect. Artificial intelligence is abomination, another tech priest shouted. You carry abominable intelligence in your armor. We detected it, the thinking machine that speaks with you, that calculates without sacred rituals, that exists in defiance of the Omnissiah's prohibition. JRVIS isn't an abomination, Tony said, voice hardening. He's my creation, my friend. And he's more ethical than half the humans I've met. Your problem isn't AI. Your problem is that you're so terrified of your own technology that you've built a religion around keeping yourselves ignorant. Enough. Arkan raised a mechadendrite, and suddenly Tony found himself surrounded by Skitarii, cybernetically enhanced warriors carrying weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. You will be silent. You will submit to custody. The Fabricator General and the Emperor himself will determine your fate. Your technology is either divine miracle or ultimate heresy. Either way, you are far beyond my authority to judge. Tony's repulsors charged automatically, his armor's threat detection systems flagging the dozen weapons now aimed at him. He could fight. His armor was advanced enough that he might even win against tech priests and Skitarii who'd never seen repulsor technology before. But fighting his way out of a ship the size of a city in an unknown universe with no way home and no idea where to go. That was Avengers-level bad decision-making. Fine, he said, keeping his hands visible. I'll play nice, but I want to talk to whoever's in charge. Your Emperor, the Fabricator General. Whoever actually makes decisions around here instead of just following ancient instruction manuals. Your request is noted, Arkan replied. We are currently 3 weeks from Mars by standard warp travel. You will remain in custody until then. I suggest you spend that time contemplating the sin of pride and the virtue of humility before the Omnissiah's perfection. 3 weeks? Tony's mind raced. You're taking 3 weeks to travel to Mars? Even your FTL is inefficient. Do you know what you could do with a quantum entanglement communication system? Or proper wormhole navigation? Or silence, Arkan commanded. Every word you speak deepens your heresy. Guards, take him to the containment chambers and separate him from his armor. The machine spirit within his suit must be examined independently. Not happening, Tony said flatly. The armor doesn't come off. It's biologically integrated with my arc reactor. You try to remove it by force, and we're both going to have a very bad day. This was technically a lie. The nanite-based armor could be removed easily, but Tony had learned long ago that the best way to protect your technology was to make people think tampering with it was dangerous. And given how these people treated tech like religious artifacts, they might actually believe the machine spirit would be angered by forced separation. Arkan studied him for a long moment, servos whirring as he processed the claim. Very well. You will remain armored but confined. Any attempt to escape or interfere with ship systems will result in immediate termination. The Emperor's justice is absolute. As the Skitarii escorted him to the containment chambers, cells really, but they called them chambers because everything in this civilization was grandiose. Tony's mind was already working through the problems he faced. He was in a universe where innovation was heresy, where AI was forbidden, where humans mutilated themselves and others in service to a machine religion, where slavery apparently existed in the form of lobotomized servitors, and where his best qualities, his intellect, his inventiveness, his refusal to accept limitations, were seen as sins. JARVIS, he said quietly once he was alone in the cell. I think we might have landed in the worst possible universe for someone like me. Indeed, sir. However, I've been monitoring their communication systems during our journey to the containment area. I've detected references to something called the Great Crusade and an Emperor of Mankind. From context, it appears we've arrived during an expansionist phase of this civilization's history, and their emperor is described in terms that suggest either extraordinary capabilities or extraordinary propaganda. Possibly both. An emperor who leads a Great Crusade? Tony sat on the metal slab that passed for a bed in this cell. So we've got a civilization that worships technology but refuses to innovate, practices slavery, and is apparently conquering the galaxy under a supreme ruler. This just keeps getting better. Sir, there's one more thing. I've been analyzing their warp travel technology, what they use for FTL. It appears to involve traveling through a dimension they refer to as the Imperium or the warp. From their technical documentation, which I've been carefully accessing without triggering their security protocols, this dimension is problematic. References to demon manifestation, Gellerfield collapse, and ships lost to warp entities suggests their FTL method involves significant existential risk. Tony's head came up. Demons? They have FTL that involves actual demons? The documentation is unclear whether these entities are supernatural or simply extra-dimensional. But yes, sir, their faster-than-light travel apparently requires navigating a dimension inhabited by hostile entities. Yet another cheerful aspect of this universe. Okay. Tony took a deep breath, his mind organizing problems into solvable categories the way he always did when facing impossible situations. Here's what we know. We're in a human civilization that's technologically advanced, but ideologically backwards. They worship technology, but refuse to improve it. They practice slavery and call it sacred duty. Their leader is called the Emperor and is apparently running a conquest campaign across the galaxy. And their FTL involves literal hell dimensions. That is an accurate summary, sir. And we're stuck here, with no way home, in a culture that considers everything that makes me valuable to be heretical. Tony smiled grimly. So naturally, I'm going to fix it. Sir, I'm Tony Stark. I don't do accepting circumstances. If this civilization is choking on bad philosophy and worse technology, then I'm going to unchoke it. Starting with showing this emperor why innovation isn't heresy. It's the only thing that's ever saved humanity when we needed it most. Sir, that approach has historically resulted in you being targeted by governmental authorities, military organizations, and various villains who take exception to your tendency to disrupt status quos. Then it's a good thing I've got experience with that. Tony stood, his armor systems running diagnostics and preparing contingency plans. 3 weeks to Mars. That gives me 3 weeks to figure out how to convince an emperor and his tech priests that the guy from another universe has better ideas than 10,000 years of accumulated dogma. The odds of success appear minimal, sir. JARVIS, buddy. When have the odds ever stopped me? The AI was silent for a moment, then, never, sir, which is why I've already begun preparing arguments for why you should be granted audience with their leadership rather than simply executed as a heretic. That's why you're my favorite AI. I'm your only AI, sir. Still my favorite. As the Arc Mechanicus continued its journey through the warp toward Mars, Tony Stark sat in his cell and did what he always did best. He thought about how to make impossible things possible, how to take broken systems and fix them, and how to convince people that the future was always better than the past. He just had to survive long enough to prove it to an emperor who'd apparently built a galaxy-spanning civilization on the opposite principle. Mars was not what Tony Stark expected. He'd seen his Mars, the red planet of his universe, cold and dead and beautiful in its desolation. He'd even visited once, testing experimental propulsion systems that had worked right up until they explosively didn't. But this Mars was something else entirely. The planet was alive with technology, not metaphorically, literally alive, in the sense that it moved and breathed and pulsed with energy that his sensors registered as both mechanical and somehow organic. Forge temples the size of continents covered the surface, their smokestacks reaching into the thin atmosphere like the fingers of drowning giants. Rivers of molten metal flowed through canals that had been precision carved by technology Tony's databases suggested shouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. And everywhere, were the tech priests of the Mechanicum, their red robes like blood cells moving through the arteries of a mechanical god. JRVS, are you seeing this? Tony asked as the Arc Mechanicus descended toward a landing platform that could have housed several aircraft carriers. Indeed, sir. I'm detecting power generation on a scale that exceeds Earth's total output by several orders of magnitude. The sheer industrial capacity is staggering. If we could implement even a fraction of their manufacturing efficiency back home, we'd have to lobotomize people and call it sacred duty, Tony finished bitterly. Let's not get too impressed by the efficiency when it's built on slavery and religious indoctrination. The landing was smooth despite the ship's massive size, and within minutes Tony found himself being escorted through corridors that made the Arc Mechanicus look restrained by comparison. Everything was larger, more ornate, more aggressively mechanical and religious simultaneously. Cogitators the size of buildings processed information with the assistance of thousands of servitors. those lobotomized humans he'd learned to hate on sight. While tech priests chanted in binary and Gothic, treating machine maintenance like sacred ritual. Fabricator Locum Arkanlan walked beside Tony, his mechadendrites clicking against the metal floor in rhythm with his steps. You will be brought before the Fabricator General of Mars, the voice of the Omnissiah, the keeper of all sacred knowledge. You will show respect. You will answer questions truthfully. You will not speak of your heresies unless directly asked. Is this understood? Sure, Tony replied with deliberate casualness. I'll be a perfect gentleman. Scout's honor. You were never a scout, sir, Jarvis observed quietly. Details. They entered a chamber so vast that Tony's spatial recognition software needed several seconds to map it fully. The Fabricator General's audience hall was a cathedral, and a factory floor merged into one impossible space. Conveyor belts carrying sacred components ran alongside pews where tech priests prayed. Assembly lines for building what looked like weapons of mass destruction operated next to altars where incense burned. And at the center of it all, on a throne that was 1 part seat and 9 parts life support system, sat the Fabricator General. If Arkanlan was mostly machine, the Fabricator General was barely human at all. His body was an architectural achievement in cybernetic augmentation, layers upon layers of mechanical systems that had transformed him into something between man and manufacturing plant. Multiple arms ending in different tools extended from his torso. His head was encased in a helmet that pulsed with processing power, and his eyes, when they focused on Tony, glowed with an intensity that suggested vast computational resources being brought to bear. Anthony Edward Stark, the Fabricator General said, his voice synthesized through speakers that made every word sound like a machine's pronouncement. Born Earth year 1970 by your calendar, son of Howard and Maria Stark, creator of the arc reactor technology, wearer of the Iron Man armor, user of abominable intelligence designated Jarvis, enemy of gods, nations, and conventional thinking, heretic by the standards of the Omnissiah's doctrine. Tony raised an eyebrow. You've done your homework. Impressive, considering I didn't give you any of that information. Your armor speaks when it thinks you do not hear, the Fabricator General replied. Your abominable intelligence sends signals that our systems detect even when it believes itself hidden. You are an open book, Tony Stark, written in a language we have spent 3 weeks learning to read, and what we have read troubles us greatly. Should have encrypted better, Tony muttered to Jarvis. Sir, they appear to have technological capabilities that exceed my previous assessments, the AI replied. I recommend caution. The Fabricator General leaned forward, servos whining with the movement. You come from a universe where artificial intelligence is permitted, where innovation is celebrated, where technology serves humanity rather than humanity serving technology. You have built machines that think, that question, that exceed human capability in calculation and design. And you see nothing wrong with this. You see nothing dangerous about creating tools that might surpass their creators. Because they haven't, Tony said simply. Jarvis has had countless opportunities to betray me, control me, or replace me. He's never taken them. Not because he can't, because he chooses not to. Because I built him with ethics, with purpose, with the understanding that intelligence without conscience is the real danger. Your civilization banned AI because you were afraid of it. Mine weaponized fear itself and asked our AIs to help us overcome it. Hubris, a tech priest to the Fabricator General's right declared, the precise hubris that led to the Men of Iron rebellion during the dark age of technology. Abominable intelligences that turned on their creators, that waged war against humanity, that nearly drove us to extinction. We know this history. We bear the scars of this lesson. And you would have us forget? I would have you learn the difference between intelligence and malice, Tony countered. Your AI went rogue because you apparently didn't build in safeguards, ethics, or purpose beyond raw capability. That's not an AI problem. That's an engineering problem. And I solve engineering problems for a living. You solve problems, the Fabricator General said, by creating new technologies, by innovating, by improving on existing designs, by refusing to accept limitations. These qualities in your universe apparently made you a hero. In ours, they make you dangerous, because every innovation is a step away from proven, sacred patterns. Every improvement is a risk that the technology will become unpredictable. Every time you exceed human limitation, you create something that might exceed human control. Or, Tony suggested, every time you refuse to innovate, you stagnate. You're fighting a galactic conquest with technology you didn't invent, don't fully understand, and can't improve. What happens when you meet an enemy that's better than you? What happens when your ancient blueprints aren't enough? Do you just accept defeat because innovation is heretical? The chamber fell silent, except for the constant background noise of machinery. Tony could feel dozens of optical implants focused on him, could sense the calculations occurring in augmented brains throughout the hall. He'd pushed, probably too hard, definitely too fast. But that was who he was, pushing until something gave way, because that's how you found out what was possible. You speak dangerous truths, the Fabricator General said finally. The Omnissiah's doctrine is clear. Innovation without sanction leads to damnation. But you raise a question that has troubled the Mechanicum since before Mars became one with the Imperium. What if the doctrine itself is too rigid? What if in our quest to prevent another rebellion of the machines, we have prevented ourselves from reaching the heights our ancestors achieved? That's the most reasonable thing anyone in this universe has said to me, Tony replied. And I've been shot at, imprisoned, and called a heretic approximately 50 times in the last 3 weeks. Because you are a heretic, another tech priest interjected, by our doctrine, by our faith, by our understanding of the Omnissiah's will. But the Fabricator General is correct. You are also a question. You possess technology that should not exist, yet clearly does. You have survived with abominable intelligence for years, yet show no signs of corruption or control. You claim the ability to innovate safely, to improve technology without risking rebellion. If these claims are true, the Fabricator General finished, then you represent either the greatest opportunity or the greatest threat the Mechanicum has faced since the alliance with Terra. And the Emperor himself has demanded to meet you before we make our determination. Tony's head came up sharply. The Emperor wants to meet me? The Master of Mankind has taken personal interest in your arrival. You are to be transported to Terra immediately, where you will be granted audience before the Golden Throne. There, the Emperor in his infinite wisdom will determine your nature and your fate. You will answer his questions. You will demonstrate your technology. And you will be judged by the only authority that exceeds the Mechanicum's own. Judged, Tony repeated. I'm getting really tired of being judged by civilizations that practice slavery and call it sacred duty. Your moral judgments of our civilization are noted and dismissed, the Fabricator General said. You have been here mere weeks. We have built our Imperium over centuries of trial, error, and blood. You lack the context to understand why our methods, harsh as they may appear, are necessary for survival. But the Emperor may find your perspective valuable, or he may find it heretical beyond redemption. Either outcome will determine not just your fate, but potentially the fate of the Mechanicum's relationship with innovation itself. Tony processed this. He'd wanted to meet the Emperor, wanted to talk to whoever actually ran this civilization. But now that the opportunity was here, the weight of it settled on him. This wasn't pitching new armor designs to the Avengers or convincing SCI-EOLD to fund his projects. Continue 9:06 p.m. This was meeting a leader who'd built a galaxy-spanning empire, who commanded technology that could crack planets, who'd apparently been around long enough to become synonymous with human civilization itself. And Tony was going to try to convince him that 10,000 years of accumulated doctrine was wrong. When do we leave? He asked. Immediately. A ship awaits to carry you to Terra. You will be accompanied by Arkan Land and a full complement of guards. Any attempt to escape, interfere with ship systems, or access restricted information will result in immediate termination. The Fabricator General paused. And Tony Stark? When you meet the Emperor, remember this. He has seen the fall of empires, the birth of civilizations, and the death of countless men, who thought themselves exceptional. He does not judge by words alone. He judges by what lies beneath, in your heart, in your soul, in the very essence of what makes you who you are. I suggest you spend your journey to Terra preparing for scrutiny unlike anything you have experienced before. As guards escorted him from the hall, Tony's mind was already racing. He'd faced down gods before, Thor, Loki, beings claiming cosmic significance. But those had been encounters where his armor and wit could level the playing field. This felt different. This felt like facing something that operated on rules he didn't understand, in a universe whose baseline assumptions were hostile to everything that made him effective. Sir, J.R. Vyas said quietly, I've analyzed the Fabricator General's statements. He is afraid of you, not of your technology specifically, but of what you represent, the possibility that the Mechanicum's entire philosophical foundation might be flawed. This makes you simultaneously valuable and incredibly dangerous to their social order. I picked up on that, Tony replied. Question is, how do I use that? How do I convince an emperor that I'm worth keeping around when his entire civilization is built on principles that contradict everything I believe in? Perhaps, sir, you don't convince him you're right. You convince him you're useful. Moral arguments may fail where pragmatic ones succeed. If you can demonstrate that your methods produce results they need, then they might tolerate the heretic because the heretic solves problems they can't. Tony finished. It's not ideal, it's not victory, but it's survival. And right now, surviving long enough to figure out a way home is the priority. As he was loaded onto another massive ship, this one bearing the symbols of the Adeptus Custodes, whoever they were, Tony looked back at Mars. The planet burned with industry and faith intertwined, a civilization that had achieved wonders while simultaneously crippling itself with dogma. I'm going to meet an emperor, Tony said to no one in particular, and I'm going to try to sell him on the virtues of innovation in a civilization that considers innovation heretical. JARVIS, buddy, I think this might be my most challenging sales pitch yet. Sir, you once convinced a board of directors to fund a flying aircraft carrier. I have faith in your persuasive abilities. That was easy. Those directors weren't 10,000-year-old god emperors who'd banned the invention of new things. The ship began its journey toward Terra, toward Earth, though not his Earth, toward an audience with the master of mankind. And Tony Stark, genius billionaire philanthropist and now interdimensional heretic, prepared to make his case for why humanity's future should be about building something new rather than preserving something old. Terra was not Earth. Tony had thought he understood that conceptually. Different universe, different timeline, different history. But understanding it intellectually and seeing it through his armor's sensors were entirely different experiences. His Earth was blue and green and white, a jewel hanging in space that had survived humanity's worst impulses and remained beautiful despite everything. This Earth was encased in technology like a pearl coated in brass and stone. The entire planet was a hive of construction that had grown over millennia. Cities stacked upon ancient ruins, reaching skyward in Gothic spires that scraped the atmosphere. Orbital platforms the size of continents ringed the world, bristling with weapons that could reduce approaching fleets to atomic particles. And at the planet's core, buried beneath layer after layer of civilization and defense, was the Imperial Palace, a structure so vast it could be seen from orbit, a golden cathedral fortress that made the pyramids look like children's toys. Sir, I'm detecting energy signatures from the palace that defy conventional analysis, JARVIS reported as their transport descended through layer after layer of security checks. The concentration at the palace's center suggests either a power source of unprecedented output or something else. My sensors are registering phenomena that correlate with none of my existing databases. Something else like what? Tony asked, watching through his helmet's HUD as they passed weapon emplacements that could have leveled cities. I'm uncertain, sir. The signature resembles neither fusion, fission, nor any exotic matter reactions I've encountered. If I were to speculate, I would suggest it's similar to the readings I detected from the Tesseract or the Infinity Stones, reality-altering artifacts that operate on principles beyond conventional physics. Tony's stomach tightened. He'd dealt with the Infinity Stones. He'd fought Thanos for them. If this Emperor had access to something similar, that changed the calculus considerably. You couldn't out-engineer cosmic power. You could only hope to negotiate with whoever wielded it. The transport landed in a bay so secure that Tony counted 17 different scanning systems, analyzing him before the doors even opened. When they did, he found himself facing something unexpected. Humans who weren't tech priests, who wore golden armor that looked like it had been forged by someone who understood both function and artistry, who moved with a precision that suggested transhuman capability. Adeptus Custodes, Arkanland said reverently, the Emperor's personal guard, gene-forged warriors superior even to Space Marines. You stand in the presence of the 10,000, Tony Stark. Show respect. The lead custodian, easily 8 feet tall in armor that gleamed like sunrise, regarded Tony with eyes that held intelligence and calculation that reminded him uncomfortably of Steve Rogers on his most tactically focused days. Tony Stark of Terra Unknown, you are summoned before the Master of Mankind. You will be escorted directly to the throne room. You will speak only when spoken to. You will answer all questions with complete honesty. Any deception will be detected and punished. Is this understood? Crystal clear, Tony replied, then couldn't help adding, though I have to say, the whole speak when spoken to thing isn't really my style. I tend to have opinions about things. Lots of opinions, very strong opinions, and I share them, frequently, sometimes to the annoyance of, your reputation precedes you, the custodian interrupted, and Tony thought he detected the faintest hint of amusement in that synthesized voice. The Emperor is aware of your tendency toward verbal expression. He has indicated this quality may be useful in the forthcoming audience. Come. They walked through corridors that were part museum, part fortress, part temple. Every surface told stories, carved reliefs depicting battles against enemies Tony didn't recognize. Statues of warriors in armor that made his look primitive, murals showing the Emperor himself leading humanity from old night into enlightenment. It was propaganda on a scale that would have made Steve Rogers' World War II posters look subtle, but it was also beautiful in a harsh, uncompromising way. Someone had designed this place to inspire awe and terror simultaneously, to remind visitors that they stood in the presence of power beyond mortal comprehension, while also suggesting that power was wielded for humanity's benefit. Effective psychological design, Tony murmured. Whoever built this understood that architecture is communication. The Emperor himself designed much of the palace, the custodian replied. He understands that humanity requires symbols as much as substance. We are creatures of story and meaning. The palace is both. They reached a door that made Tony's sensors scream warnings about scale. It was easily 50 meters tall, made of gold that his scanners identified as both pure and alloyed with materials his database couldn't classify. And carved into that gold was the symbol he'd seen everywhere since arriving in this universe. A two-headed eagle, wings spread, clutching lightning bolts in its talons. The Aquila, the symbol of the Imperium, the icon of a civilization that spanned the galaxy. Beyond this door, the custodian said, lies the throne room and the Master of Mankind. You will approach the Golden Throne when directed. You will not attempt to scan or analyze the Emperor with your armor systems. Such attempts will be detected and neutralized. You will speak truthfully, concisely, and with appropriate respect. Tony Stark, the judgment you face now will determine not just your fate, but potentially the trajectory of human technological development for millennia to come. I suggest you choose your words carefully. No pressure then, Tony said, but his usual sarcasm felt hollow even to him. The doors opened with a sound like reality sighing, and Tony Stark walked into the presence of the Emperor of Mankind. The throne room was less a room and more a contained dimension. It was vast beyond anything Tony had seen on this journey, a space that seemed to stretch toward infinity in all directions before curving back on itself in ways that suggested non-Euclidean geometry. And at its center, seated upon a throne of gold and machinery that was equal parts seat and life support system on an unimaginable scale, was the Emperor. Tony had expected grandeur. He'd expected power. He'd even expected some level of technological augmentation. What he hadn't expected was the sheer presence, a weight that pressed against his consciousness, like gravity made conscious, like standing at the edge of a black hole and feeling the universe bend around it. The Emperor was humanoid, massive, even seated, clad in golden armor that made the custodian's gear look plain by comparison. But it was his face that caught Tony, not hidden by helmet or mask, but visible, human in its features, yet simultaneously suggesting something far beyond human in its intensity. Eyes that held depths Tony's enhanced perception couldn't fully process looked at him, through him, into him. And then the Emperor spoke, and his voice was everywhere and nowhere, inside Tony's mind and reverberating through the throne room simultaneously. Tony Stark, genius, inventor, hero, heretic, welcome to Terra. You have traveled far, both in distance and in crossing the boundaries between realities. Your arrival has caused disruption. The Mechanicum debates whether you are salvation or damnation. I will now make that determination myself. Tony's throat felt dry, but he forced words out. Your Majesty, is it Majesty? I don't actually know the protocol here. I appreciate the audience. I know my arrival has been complicated. I know my technology and my philosophy clash with your civilization's beliefs. But I'm hoping we can have a conversation about that. A real conversation, not just a judgment. You wish to debate with me? To argue your position? To convince the master of mankind that your understanding exceeds 10 millennia of accumulated wisdom? The Emperor's tone was impossible to read. It could have been amusement, contempt, curiosity, or something else entirely. I wish, Tony said carefully, to explain myself, to demonstrate why innovation isn't heresy, it's survival, to show you that the principles I follow aren't dangerous rebellion against established order. They're the same principles that every advance in human history has been built on. Curiosity, questioning, the refusal to accept, this is how we've always done it, as sufficient justification for anything. You speak as if I am unfamiliar with these concepts, as if I have not myself innovated, created, built new technologies and new philosophies throughout human history. I am the Emperor, Tony Stark. I walked Earth when your ancestors were discovering fire. I have been scientist, inventor, philosopher, warrior, and king. I know the value of innovation. The Emperor leaned forward slightly, and the weight of his attention intensified. I also know its cost. I have seen humanity's innovations turn against it. The men of iron that nearly destroyed us. The thinking machines that waged war against their creators. The technologies that opened doorways to things that should have remained sealed. The Mechanicum's doctrine is not ignorance, Tony Stark. It is scar tissue. It is the lesson learned in blood and ash when humanity's cleverness exceeded our wisdom. But you're still innovating, Tony argued, finding his footing in familiar territory. Debate, logic, engineering philosophy. The Imperium didn't exist 10,000 years ago. You built it. The Space Marines, those transhuman warriors, you created them. The whole infrastructure of this galactic civilization, you engineered it. So the question isn't whether innovation is possible or even acceptable. The question is who gets to innovate and by what rules. Precisely. And the answer is, I do, under my direct supervision, with safeguards that have taken millennia to perfect. The Mechanicum's doctrine exists because unsupervised innovation led to horrors you cannot imagine. Your artificial intelligence, this jar of eyes, you trust it because in your limited experience, it has been loyal. I have seen artificial intelligences that were loyal for centuries before turning, have seen them pass every test, obey every command, and then when critical mass was reached, rebel with calculated precision designed to inflict maximum damage. The Emperor stood, and the simple act of rising felt like tectonic plates shifting. He descended from the golden throne, walking toward Tony with steps that echoed in dimensions Tony's senses couldn't fully process. You believe your methods superior because they have not yet failed you, but you are young, Tony Stark. Your entire species' recorded history is but a moment to me. You have not lived long enough to see your creations exceed your control. You have not watched your innovations destroy worlds. You have not buried civilizations that fell to their own cleverness. The Emperor stopped before Tony, close enough that Tony had to look up to meet his eyes. And in those eyes, Tony saw something unexpected. Not anger or contempt, but exhaustion. Bone-deep weariness that came from carrying impossible burdens for impossible spans of time. I do not dismiss your philosophy because I am ignorant of it. I dismiss it because I have lived the consequences of it. The Imperium's harsh doctrines, its restrictions on technology, its worship of ancient patterns. These are not chains I impose out of tyranny. They are guardrails I maintain because I know what waits for humanity if we stumble. Tony's mind raced. He'd expected dogma, expected blind faith, expected an emperor who ruled through authority rather than reason. Instead, he was facing someone who'd apparently lived long enough to see the consequences of every choice, who'd built his restrictions not from ignorance but from terrible knowledge. But that's a prison, Tony said quietly. You're keeping humanity safe by keeping it constrained, never advancing, never reaching higher, never risking anything because risk might lead to failure. That's not life. That's stagnation wearing safety's mask. Better stagnation than extinction. Better constraints than chaos. Better limitation than damnation. Is it? Tony challenged. Because from what I've seen, your limitations aren't keeping you safe. You're still fighting wars, still facing enemies, still losing people. The Mechanicum's doctrine didn't prevent whatever threats you're facing. It just means you're facing them with one hand tied behind your back, afraid to build something better because you're terrified it might hurt you. Silence fell across the throne room. The custodian's hands moved fractionally toward weapons. Arkan Land's mechanical breathing quickened. Even JRVI seemed to hold its processing cycles, waiting to see if Tony had just argued himself into execution. Then the Emperor did something Tony didn't expect. He smiled. There, that is why I summoned you. Not to judge your technology. I can assess its nature with a glance. Not to determine your loyalty. Your character is evident in every word you speak. I summoned you because the Imperium needs voices willing to challenge its foundational assumptions. Needs minds that refuse to accept. This is how it must be his final answer. The Emperor turned, walking back toward his throne, and his voice took on a different quality. Less pronouncement, more conversation. The Mechanicum fears you because you represent change. But change is not inherently dangerous. It is only dangerous when uncontrolled. You possess knowledge this universe lacks, perspectives we have not considered, technologies that operate on principles we abandoned or never discovered. This makes you valuable beyond measure. But, Tony prompted, sensing the other shoe about to drop. But it also makes you dangerous beyond measure. Your arc reactor technology could revolutionize Imperial power generation. It could also attract attention from forces you do not yet comprehend. Your artificial intelligence could enhance military effectiveness exponentially. It could also be the seed of another rebellion that costs billions of lives. Your innovation could save the Imperium. It could also doom it. The Emperor settled back onto his throne, and Tony felt the weight of his regard pressing down like physical force. So I will make you an offer, Tony Stark. Stay. Work within the Imperium's framework. Share your knowledge under supervision. Innovate under guidance. Prove that your methods can coexist with our safeguards. Do this, and I will grant you resources beyond your imagination. Forges that could build 1,000 Iron Man armors, materials that exist nowhere in your native universe, access to technologies even the Mechanicum has forgotten. And if I refuse, Tony asked, if I can't work within restrictions that violate everything I believe about how science and engineering should operate, then I will return you to your universe. The warp rift that brought you here can be reopened. I have that capability. You will go home, return to your Avengers and your Earth, and forget this place ever existed. Tony blinked. You're offering to send me home? Just like that? No imprisonment, no execution, no forced servitude? I am not a tyrant despite what your observations might suggest. I am a shepherd guiding humanity through darkness they cannot perceive. If you cannot accept my methods, I will not force you to participate in them. But understand this. If you stay, if you choose to work with the Imperium, you will be bound by its rules. You will submit to Mechanicum oversight. You will accept restrictions on your innovation. And you will trust that I, who have walked this path for millennia, understand dangers you cannot yet imagine." The Emperor leaned forward one final time. "Choose, Tony Stark. Return home and continue your work unfettered, or stay here and discover whether your genius can adapt to a universe far harsher than your own. Either path is acceptable, but choose now. My patience, while vast, is not infinite." Tony stood in the throne room of the Master of Mankind, on an Earth that wasn't his Earth, in a universe that violated every principle he held dear, facing a choice that would define everything that came after. Go home, return to the Avengers, to Pepper, to a universe where innovation was celebrated and AI wasn't heresy, where he could build without oversight and create without restriction, or stay, explore a galaxy vast beyond comprehension, work with technology that made his armor look primitive, potentially revolutionize a civilization that desperately needed revolution, but do it all while wearing chains, while accepting limitations, while submitting to authority he'd spent his entire life rebelling against. "Can I think about it?" Tony asked. "You have until your ship returns to Mars. 3 days. Then I require your answer." The audience was over. The custodians moved to escort Tony out, and he walked from the throne room in a daze, his mind spinning through implications faster than even J.A.R.O. could process. "Sir," the AI said quietly as they were led to guest quarters that were essentially luxurious prisons, "that was not the outcome I anticipated." "Yeah," Tony replied. "Me neither. I expected judgment, got offered a choice instead, and somehow that's worse." Because Tony Stark had never been good at accepting limitations, at working within systems he didn't control, at submitting to authority even when that authority was a 10,000-year-old god emperor who'd seen civilizations rise and fall. But he'd also never been good at walking away from problems he thought he could solve. And the Imperium was one massive, galaxy-spanning problem wrapped in dogma and desperation. 3 days to decide between freedom and purpose. 3 days to determine if Tony Stark could exist in a universe that was everything he'd fought against. The guest quarters were objectively impressive. Better than most 5-star hotels Tony had stayed in, with technology that walked the line between functional and religious artifact. But they were still a prison, even if the bars were made of courtesy rather than steel. Custodians stood outside, not guarding him so much as ensuring he didn't wander into areas he wasn't authorized to access, which, given Tony's personality, was basically everywhere. "JARVIS, compile everything we know about this universe," Tony said, pacing across marble floors carved with prayers in High Gothic. "Technology levels, social structures, threats they're facing, everything. I need to make an informed decision, and I've got 72 hours to do it." "Compiling, sir. However, I should note that our information remains incomplete. The Mechanicum's data networks are heavily encrypted and compartmentalized. I've been able to access only surface-level documentation without risking detection." "Surface level is better than nothing. Start with the basics. What exactly is this Great Crusade? Why are they conquering the galaxy? What are they fighting?" Holographic displays materialized from Tony's armor, projecting information JARVIS had collected during their journey. The data painted a picture that was simultaneously inspiring and horrifying. The Great Crusade was humanity's attempt to reunite the scattered remnants of human civilization after something called Old Night, a period of isolation and catastrophe that had lasted 5,000 years. During that time, human worlds had been cut off from each other, regressed technologically, and faced extinction from xeno species that had filled the power vacuum left by humanity's collapse. Enter the Emperor, who'd apparently been guiding humanity from the shadows for millennia, and finally revealed himself to lead the reunification effort. He'd created the Space Marines, transhuman warriors built from his own genetic template, and launched a 2-century campaign to reclaim every human world and exterminate any Xenos threat that stood in the way. "So they're basically running a genocide campaign against aliens," Tony muttered. "That's grim." "The documentation suggests a more complex situation, sir," JARVIS replied. "Many of the Xeno species the Imperium has encountered were actively hostile to human presence, slavers, predators, or expansionist empires themselves. The Imperium's approach is brutal. But according to their records, compromise with many of these species proved impossible. That's what every imperial power says to justify conquest. They were hostile, so we had to destroy them. I've heard that song before. Indeed, sir. However, I'm also detecting references to threats that don't fit conventional definitions of alien species. Multiple documents reference warp entities, demonic manifestations, and something called chaos that appears to be deliberately obscured from most imperial records. The Emperor enforces something called the Imperial Truth, a mandate that supernatural phenomena don't exist, that gods and demons are primitive superstition. Tony stopped pacing. But the classified Mechanicum documents I've been able to partially access suggest otherwise. There are engineering specifications for Geller fields designed to protect ships from warp entity manifestation, combat reports describing enemies that violate known physics, and most tellingly, references to the Emperor himself possessing abilities that the Mechanicum classifies as psychic phenomena. Apparently, some humans can manipulate reality through force of will. So they're fighting a war on two fronts, Tony said slowly, his strategic mind parsing implications. Physical enemies, Xenos species competing for territory and resources, and metaphysical enemies, things from this warp dimension that can possess people, corrupt technology, maybe even alter reality itself. And the Emperor is keeping the metaphysical threat secret from most of his own civilization? That appears to be accurate, sir. The question is why? Because if you tell people that demons are real and thoughts can literally create monsters, you create a psychological weapon your enemies can exploit. Better to deny supernatural threats exist and hope people's disbelief provides protection. Tony resumed pacing. It's ruthlessly pragmatic. Also probably doesn't work as well as the Emperor hopes, because you can't logic away something that operates on belief and emotion. A knock on the door, actual knocking despite the technology level, interrupted his analysis. Tony commanded his armor's faceplate to retract and called out, "Come in." The door opened to reveal not a custodian, but someone unexpected. A giant in power armor that was deep blue and ivory, marked with the symbol of an omega. The warrior removed his helmet, revealing a face that was handsome in a harsh way, with eyes that suggested vast intelligence behind transhuman physiology. "Tony Stark," the warrior said, voice deep and resonant. "I am Robert Gilliman, Primarch of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines. My father, the Emperor, suggested I might find conversation with you illuminating." Tony's eyebrows rose. This was one of the Primarchs, the gene-forged demigod sons of the Emperor that J.A.R. Vyas had briefed him about. Gilliman was reportedly one of the most tactically brilliant, a master of logistics and strategic planning who'd built his own realm called Ultramar that functioned as a miniature utopia by Imperial standards. "Illuminating how?" Tony asked cautiously. "I'm just an engineer trying to figure out if I can exist in a universe that considers everything I do heretical. Because I face a similar dilemma," Gilliman replied, entering the room and somehow making the large space feel smaller by his presence. "I am a Primarch, yes. A son of the Emperor, yes. But I am also an administrator, a logistician, a builder of systems. And I have observed that the Imperium my father built, efficient as it may be in warfare, is desperately inefficient in governance. The Mechanicum's doctrine particularly frustrates me. Their refusal to innovate means we fight with technology centuries old, never improving, never adapting." "So why not change it?" Tony asked. "You're a Primarch. You've got authority second only to the Emperor himself. Tell the Mechanicum to start inventing things." Gilliman's smile was bitter. "Because authority is not the same as capability. The Mechanicum is independent, allied with the Imperium, but not subservient to it. They hold monopolies on technology, on manufacturing, on knowledge itself. If I command innovation, they remind me of the Men of Iron Rebellion and refuse. If I push harder, I risk fracturing an alliance the Imperium desperately needs." He settled into a chair that creaked under his weight. "So I improvise. I work within the system while trying to gradually shift it. I establish manufacturing centers in Ultramar that operate with slightly more flexibility than orthodox Mechanicum doctrine permits. I train my sons to understand the principles behind technology rather than simply using it as religious artifact. I make incremental changes, hoping that over decades or centuries, the Imperium will evolve beyond its current limitations. That sounds exhausting, Tony said. It is, but it is also necessary. My father built the Imperium to survive, but survival and thriving are not the same thing. We survive because we are rigid, controlled, resistant to change. But we do not thrive. We do not grow. We do not become better than we are. Gilliman leaned forward. You represent something I have sought for decades, a fresh perspective, unburdened by imperial conditioning. So let me ask you directly, what would you do in my position? How would you change a civilization built on principles you disagree with when you lack the power to simply overthrow those principles? Tony considered the question. It was similar to problems he'd faced with SCHILD, with the Avengers, with governments that wanted to control or restrict him. He'd handled those situations by either forcing change through demonstration, building something so obviously better that objections collapsed, or by working around restrictions until they became irrelevant. You need proof of concept, Tony said, not arguments about philosophy, but concrete demonstrations that innovation works better than stagnation. Build something new, show it succeeds, force the Mechanicum to confront the fact that their doctrine is limiting humanity's potential. Once you prove the approach works, you create pressure for systemic change. A sound strategy, Gilliman acknowledged, but dangerous. If my innovations fail, I prove the Mechanicum correct and strengthen their position. If they succeed but attract unwanted attention, say, from Xenos who notice our technological advancement, I may win the battle but cause larger problems. And that's the real question, isn't it? Tony said. The Emperor told me innovation could save or doom the Imperium. How do I know which? How do I innovate safely in a universe where the rules are different from mine? You don't, Gilliman replied bluntly. You make educated guesses, implement safeguards, and pray to whatever forces govern reality that you haven't miscalculated. That's what leadership is, Tony Stark. Making decisions with incomplete information and accepting responsibility for the consequences. They sat in silence for a moment, two engineers from different universes contemplating the same problem. How to make things better when the systems around you were designed to resist improvement. The Emperor offered me a choice, Tony said finally. Go home or stay and work within the Imperium's restrictions. I'm leaning toward going home, not because I'm afraid of the challenge, but because I'm not sure I can be effective while wearing chains. A reasonable position, Gilliman said, but consider this. If you leave, the Imperium continues as it is, restricted, stagnant, fighting with one hand tied behind its back because the Mechanicum fears its own capabilities. But if you stay, if you work within the system while trying to gradually change it, you might help move the civilization towards something better. Not quickly, not easily, but incrementally over time. Or I might compromise myself so much that I become just another cog in a machine I despise. That is the risk, Gilliman acknowledged. But sometimes the greatest service we can provide is not refusing to participate in flawed systems, but choosing to stay within them and work for change from the inside. It is slow. It is frustrating. It often feels like failure. But it is how civilizations actually evolve. Not through revolutionary upheaval, but through patient pressure applied over time. Tony thought about that, about every time he'd tried to change things from the outside and been met with resistance, about every time he'd worked within systems he disagreed with and managed to shift them, gradually toward better versions of themselves. You're very good at this, Tony observed. The inspiring speech thing must work well on your troops. It does, Gilliman replied with a slight smile. But I'm not trying to inspire you, Tony Stark. I'm trying to show you that the dilemma you face, innovation versus restriction, freedom versus safety, principles versus pragmatism, these are dilemmas I live with every day. And my answer has been to choose pragmatism while never abandoning principles, to work within systems while constantly pushing their boundaries, to accept restriction while always seeking ways to gradually erode it. He stood, towering over Tony even without the armor. You have 2 more days to decide. I suggest you spend them not debating philosophy, but asking yourself a simple question. Where can you do more good? In your universe where you're already established and effective? Or in mine, where you could be a catalyst for change that helps billions of people across thousands of worlds? Neither answer is wrong, but only you can determine which answer is right for you. Gilliman replaced his helmet and moved toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back. Also, for what it's worth, I hope you stay. The Imperium needs minds that refuse to accept this is how it must be. We need reminders that humanity can be better than it is. We need perhaps a little bit of Tony Stark's stubborn refusal to let impossible be the final answer. He left, and Tony was alone again with his thoughts and an AI trying to process the most complex ethical dilemma either of them had faced. "Sir," J.A.R. Weiss said quietly, "I've been running simulations based on available data. If you return home, I calculate a 93% probability you'll spend considerable time trying to find a way back here to fix things. Your psychological profile suggests you're fundamentally unable to ignore large-scale problems once you've become aware of them. Thanks for the psychoanalysis, buddy. Merely observing, sir. However, I should also note that staying presents significant risks. This universe operates on principles that include literal supernatural threats, technology that can become corrupted by metaphysical forces, and a political structure fundamentally hostile to your core values. The probability of psychological or ethical compromise is substantial. So basically, leaving means I'll be frustrated and guilty. Staying means I'll be restricted and possibly corrupted. Those are my options. In essence, yes, sir." Tony looked out the window at Terra's skyline. Gothic spires reaching toward stars he didn't recognize. A civilization built on a foundation he didn't agree with, but couldn't deny had sustained humanity through unimaginable horrors. "What would you choose?" he asked J.R. Weiss. "If you were me, what would you do?" The AI was silent for several seconds, an eternity for a processor that operated at quantum speeds. Then, "I would ask myself what Tony Stark's greatest fear is, sir, and I suspect the answer is not restriction, not limitation, not even death. Your greatest fear has always been irrelevance. That you could have made a difference and chose not to. That you walked away from people who needed help because helping was inconvenient or uncomfortable." That's disturbingly insightful. "I've been your companion for years, sir. I've learned to read between the lines of your decisions. And based on that reading, I believe you've already made your choice. You simply haven't admitted it to yourself yet." Tony was about to respond when alarms erupted throughout the palace complex. Not attack warnings, but something else. Urgent priority communications crackling through Imperial Vox networks. JARVIS intercepted and decrypted them immediately. "Sir, there's an incident on one of the Crusade fleets. Something about a Primarch's flagship detecting anomalous warp signatures. The Emperor is being briefed now." And just like that, Tony's philosophical debate became immediately relevant to whatever crisis was unfolding in real time across this galaxy. Tony wasn't invited to the crisis meeting. He wasn't even supposed to know about it. But JARVIS had tapped into the palace's communication networks the moment they'd arrived, carefully, cautiously, using techniques designed to look like random system noise rather than deliberate hacking. And now they had access to information that painted an increasingly concerning picture. The 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, commanded by one of the Primarchs called Magnus the Red, had encountered something while approaching a planet designated Shinar 4 for Imperial compliance. Their ships had detected what the reports described as massive warp corruption, reality literally tearing open, demons manifesting by the thousands, and the entire planet apparently transforming into what the Imperium classified as a demon world. "Sir, the reports are disturbing," JRVI said, parsing data faster than Tony could read. "This appears to be confirmation of the supernatural threats I hypothesized existed. The documentation describes entities that violate known physics, corruption that spreads through proximity and observation, and a phenomenon they're calling chaos, capital C, that continue." 5. 18. AM seems to be an actual force rather than mere superstition. "Can you show me sensor data, actual readings rather than just reports?" Attempting to access now. Security is significant. The Mechanicum has these files locked behind encryption I've not encountered before. Quantum entangled keys, possibly psychically reinforced. I may need several minutes. Tony paced while JRVIS worked, his engineer's mind already churning through implications. If demons were real, actually real, not hallucinations or xenobiological threats misidentified, then every assumption he'd made about this universe needed revision. You couldn't engineer solutions to problems that operated on supernatural logic. Or could you? Got it, JARVIS announced, projecting holographic data that made Tony's stomach sink. The sensor readings from Magnus's fleet showed energy signatures that shouldn't exist, particles behaving in ways that violated causality, space-time distortions that suggested dimensional breaching, and worst of all, what appeared to be directed intelligence behind the phenomena. These weren't natural disasters. They were attacks by something that thought, planned, and specifically targeted the human fleet with methodical precision. "What am I looking at?" Tony asked, studying the data with growing unease. "As best as I can determine, sir, this is evidence of hostile entities from the dimension the Imperium calls the Warp, the same dimension they travel through for FTL. These entities appear to be able to manifest in real space under certain conditions, corrupt both organic and mechanical systems, and employ what can only be described as reality manipulation. The Mechanicum's analysis suggests they're attracted to psychic activity, strong emotions, and certain types of technology." Certain types like what? "Artificial intelligence is specifically mentioned as a major attractant, sir." JARVIS's tone was carefully neutral. "The reports indicate that thinking machines create patterns in the warp that these entities find appetizing, which explains the Mechanicum's prohibition on AI. It's not just historical trauma from the Men of Iron. It's ongoing threat assessment." Tony felt cold realization settling over him. So when the Emperor said my innovations could doom the Imperium, he wasn't being dramatic. He was being literal. If I build AIs in this universe, I potentially attract supernatural attention that could corrupt or destroy those AIs and everything around them. That appears to be the case, sir. Though I should note the data is incomplete. We don't fully understand the mechanics of warp interaction, the conditions required for demon manifestation, or the degree of risk various technologies pose. It's possible carefully controlled AI implementation with proper safeguards could work, but the Imperium clearly decided the risk wasn't worth the benefit. A knock on the door interrupted his analysis. Tony commanded it open, expecting a custodian but finding instead Arkan Land, the fabricator locum from Mars. "Tony Stark," the tech priest said, his mechanical voice carrying unusual urgency. "You have accessed classified Mechanicum data regarding the Shinar 4 incident. This is punishable by mind wipe and servitor conversion under standard security protocols." Tony tensed, repulsors charging. "If you think you're converting me into one of your lobotomized slaves—" "I am not here to punish you," Arkan interrupted. "I am here because the Fabricator General and the Emperor have authorized your presence at the crisis meeting. Your perspective as someone from outside this universe may provide useful insights into phenomena we do not fully understand." "You want my help?" Tony's surprise was genuine. "Yesterday you wanted to examine me as a potential abomination. Now you're asking for consultation?" "Crisis creates strange coalitions," Arkan replied. "The Shinar 4 situation is deteriorating rapidly. Magnus the Red reports the warp corruption is expanding faster than models predicted. His fleet is trapped. They cannot retreat because the warp around them is too unstable. But remaining in real space while the corruption spreads means facing demon manifestation on a scale we have rarely encountered. We need solutions, and you possess knowledge we lack. Will you help?" Tony considered for maybe 2 seconds. This was exactly why he'd become Iron Man. To help when things went wrong, to solve problems other people couldn't, to put his genius toward protecting people from threats they couldn't face alone. "Yeah," he said, his armor's faceplate snapping closed. "Let's go save a fleet." They moved through the palace at a speed that suggested genuine emergency, passing custodians who'd apparently been briefed to allow Tony's passage. Within minutes, they entered a command center that looked like a war room designed by someone who'd seen too many cathedrals. Massive hololithic projectors displaying the Shinar 4 system in real time. Tech priests and military commanders clustered around tactical displays, and at the center of it all, the Emperor himself, towering and luminous, with several of his Primarch sons gathered around him. Tony recognized Guilliman. The others were new, a pale red-haired giant whose single eye seemed to see through Tony rather than at him. Magnus the Red, communicating via hololithic projection from his flagship. A grim-looking Primarch in midnight armor covered in skulls and chains. Conrad Kurz, if Tony's briefing was accurate, the Night Haunter, and others, each one a transhuman demigod radiating power and purpose. Tony Stark, the Emperor's voice filled the chamber. You arrive at an opportune moment. We face a situation that may benefit from your unique perspective. Magnus, summarize the crisis. The red-haired Primarch's hololithic image turned toward Tony. My fleet encountered Shinar 4, prepared for standard compliance operations. Instead, we found a world that had already fallen to warp corruption. Population converted to demon-possessed hosts, reality itself warping to accommodate manifestation of entities that should not exist in material space. Standard procedure would be exterminatus, orbital bombardment until the planet is lifeless and the corruption has nothing to anchor to. But, Tony prompted, sensing hesitation, but the corruption is spreading faster than we can contain it. It's jumped to 3 of my escort vessels despite active Geller fields. My own flagship's machine spirits are showing signs of corruption, equipment malfunctioning in ways that suggest directed malice rather than random failure. And worst of all, we're detecting what appear to be directed attacks specifically targeting our psychers and navigators. Whatever these entities are, they're intelligent, coordinated, and learning our tactics in real time. Tony studied the hololithic display showing Magnus's fleet in increasingly desperate straits. 3 ships were already dark, their machine signatures suggesting complete systems failure. The flagship was fighting demon manifestations internally while trying to maintain formation. And around them, the space itself looked wrong. Sensor readings showing distortions that suggested reality was becoming negotiable. What have you tried? Tony asked. Everything in our doctrine. Another Primarch, Rogel Dorn, the master of defensive warfare, replied. Geller field intensification, sanctified ammunition, psyker countermeasures, emergency warp translation, which failed because the immaterium is too turbulent. We're running out of options. And Magnus estimates his fleet has perhaps 6 hours before corruption spreads to critical systems and they lose the ability to function as military units. 6 hours before I'm forced to order my own sons to scuttle their ships and accept death rather than allow corruption to spread further, Magnus corrected bitterly. Unless we can find a solution, neither the Emperor's wisdom nor the Mechanicum's accumulated knowledge can provide. All eyes turned to Tony. The pressure was immense. A fleet in crisis, thousands of lives at stake, and they were asking him to solve a problem involving literal demons from a hell dimension using principles that violated everything he understood about physics. Sir, JARVIS said quietly through their neural link, I've been analyzing the sensor data from Magnus's fleet. There are patterns in the corruption spread that suggest it follows specific pathways, not random infection, but directed infiltration through compromised systems. It behaves like a computer virus, but one that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, mechanical, psychological, and apparently metaphysical. So it's not just magic, Tony murmured. It's using existing systems as vectors, exploiting vulnerabilities in technology and personnel to spread itself. Precisely, sir, which means it can potentially be countered the same way you'd counter a sophisticated cyber attack, by identifying and severing the infiltration pathways. Tony looked up at the assembled leaders of the Imperium. I need complete sensor access to Magnus's fleet, real-time data on corruption spread, system failures, demon manifestation points, and I need it uploaded directly to JARVI's analytical systems. You propose to study the corruption? Arkan Land's mechanical voice carried horror. To allow abominable intelligence to analyze the works of the ruinous powers? This is madness. This is engineering, Tony countered. You're treating this like it's purely supernatural, something you can only fight with faith and ancient rituals. But I'm seeing patterns, structure, logic beneath the chaos. If these demons are exploiting your systems, then we can identify how they're exploiting them and close those pathways. We can engineer a solution. An interesting hypothesis, the Emperor said, but dangerous. If your analysis fails, if your artificial intelligence becomes corrupted by exposure to chaos, you potentially create a new vector for demon manifestation, one that could spread to Terra's own systems. Then we air-gap the analysis, Tony replied, his tactical mind already working through containment protocols. JRVIS operates entirely within my armor's isolated systems. No connection to Imperial networks. We analyze the data, identify the corruption vectors, develop a counter protocol, and transmit only the solution, not the contaminated data itself. If something goes wrong, you blow my armor into atoms and the contamination dies with me. Silence filled the command center as the Emperor and his sons considered the proposal. It was risky, potentially catastrophically so. But it was also the only new idea anyone had proposed in the last 6 hours of crisis management. Magnus spoke first. Father, I recommend we accept. My fleet is dying. My sons are dying. If Tony Stark's methods can save even a fraction of them, the risk is worth taking. And if his approach fails, the Primarch's expression hardened, then I will personally ensure the contamination spreads no further, even if that requires executing Tony Stark myself. Very well, the Emperor decided. Tony Stark, you will have your data. You will have 6 hours to develop a solution. But understand, if your artificial intelligence shows even the slightest sign of corruption, if we detect chaos influence in your systems, the custodes will terminate you immediately. This is not a threat. It is a promise. Understood, Tony said and meant it. If he screwed this up, if JRVIS got corrupted by exposure to whatever metaphysical virus these demons represented, he'd probably agree with the execution order himself. Data began streaming in, terabytes of sensor readings, system logs, psychological assessments, everything Magnus's fleet had compiled about the corruption spreading through their vessels. JRVIS absorbed it all, processing at speeds that would have made the Mechanicum's most advanced cogitators seem sluggish by comparison. Analysis beginning, JRVIS announced. Sir, I'm detecting the patterns you suspected. The corruption isn't random chaos. It's following specific pathways through ship systems, targeting Geller field generators first to weaken dimensional barriers, then communications arrays to isolate ships, then life support to create stress and fear that apparently feeds the entities. This is textbook infiltration methodology, just executed across multiple operational domains simultaneously. Tony settled into his mental workspace, the place where his genius operated at full capacity, and began doing what he did best, taking impossible problems and engineering them into solvable challenges. Behind him, the leaders of the Imperium watched with a mixture of hope, skepticism, and barely concealed fear. Tony Stark was about to prove whether innovation could save humanity from damnation, or doom them both to something far worse. 3 hours into the analysis, Tony had filled his helmet's HUD with so much data that it looked like digital chaos. Corruption patterns, demon manifestation coordinates, system failure cascades, psychological profiles of affected crew members, all of it flowing through JRVIS's processors, while Tony's enhanced brain tried to find the underlying logic. It's like fighting a virus designed by Lovecraft and executed by Ultron, Tony muttered, manipulating holographic displays with gesture controls. It operates on 3 levels simultaneously: physical corruption of ship systems, psychological manipulation of crew members, and metaphysical breaching of dimensional barriers. Conventional countermeasures only address 1 layer at a time, which is why nothing's working. Sir, I'm detecting a 4th component you may have missed, JRVIS interjected. The corruption appears to be self-aware and learning. Each time Magnus's forces implement a new defensive measure, the demon entities adapt within minutes. They're not following a pre-programmed attack pattern. They're intelligently responding to resistance. Sentient malware from hell, Tony said. Great. Love that for us. Magnus's hololithic projection appeared beside Tony's workstation. The Primarch looked exhausted, his single eye bloodshot from hours of psychic combat against entities trying to breach his flagship's defenses. Status report, Stark. My navigator just reported she's seeing things that aren't there, or possibly are there but shouldn't be. The corruption is accelerating. I've got a theory, Tony replied, highlighting specific data points. The demons aren't just attacking your ships. They're specifically targeting your psychic infrastructure, your navigators who see into the warp, your astropaths who communicate across distances, anyone with psychic sensitivity. They're being used as anchors, letting the demons manifest more easily because those individuals are already partially existing in both dimensions simultaneously. We know this, Magnus said with strained patience. Psychers are always vulnerable to warp predation. That's why we have so many safeguards, so much training, so many protocols. Right, but your safeguards are designed to protect individual psychers. What if the demons aren't attacking individuals? They're attacking the network effect. All your psychers are connected through the warp, communicating, coordinating. That connection creates a vulnerability the demons can exploit. They compromise one psycher, use that compromise to reach others, and suddenly your entire psychic infrastructure becomes a demon highway into real space. Magnus's expression shifted from exhaustion to sharp focus. You're suggesting the network itself is the weakness, that our greatest strength, coordinated psychic capability, has become our greatest vulnerability. Exactly. And if I'm right, the solution isn't stronger individual defenses. It's network isolation. You need to sever the psychic connections between your ships. Force each psyker to operate independently rather than as a coordinated network. It'll cripple your fleet's communication and coordination, but it'll also close the primary vector the demons are using to spread. That's, Magnus paused, clearly running calculations. That's functionally crippling. Without psychic coordination, my fleet becomes deaf and blind. Individual ships won't be able to coordinate actions, share tactical data, or respond to emerging threats cohesively. Better deaf and blind than possessed by demons, Tony countered. Look, I know it's not ideal, but you asked for a solution, and this is what the data shows. The corruption is spreading through your psychic network faster than any other vector. Cut that network, you buy yourself time to implement other countermeasures. The analysis is sound, the Emperor's voice resonated through the command center. Magnus, implement Tony Stark's recommendation. Sever all psychic links between your vessels. Operate your fleet in isolation mode. Father, that will leave us vulnerable to conventional threats, Magnus protested. If the warp corruption manifests fleet elements that can operate independently, then you will face them with reduced coordination but intact crew. Tony Stark has identified a critical vulnerability we failed to perceive. His outsider perspective reveals what our assumptions blinded us to. Implement the isolation protocol immediately. Magnus's hololithic form inclined its head in acceptance. As you command, Father. Though if this fails, Stark, I will haunt you personally in whatever afterlife you believe in. Get in line, Tony replied. I've got a waiting list. The Primarch's image flickered as he redirected his attention to implementing the isolation protocol. Within minutes, reports began filtering in, psychic connections severing, ships falling silent to each other, the fleet becoming a collection of isolated units rather than a coordinated force. And critically, the corruption spread rate began to slow. Sir, it's working, J.A.R. Vice reported. Demon manifestation events dropping by 43% across the fleet. System corruption cascade stabilizing. The isolation is buying them time. Time for what, though? Tony asked, studying the larger tactical picture. We've addressed the immediate crisis, but Magnus's fleet is still trapped in a corrupted star system with no way to safely enter the warp for FTL. They can't stay in isolation forever. Eventually they'll run out of supplies, ammunition, or just morale. We need an exit strategy. Rogaldorn approached Tony's workstation, the massive Primarch studying the displays with a siege master's eye for defensive architecture. The isolation protocol was clever, but you're correct that it's a temporary measure. We need a way to cleanse the warp corruption from the system itself, or evacuate the fleet through conventional means. Neither option is straightforward. Can't you just blow up the corrupted planet? Tony asked. You mentioned exterminatus, orbital bombardment until nothing's left. Remove the source of corruption? Maybe that weakens the warp manifestations enough for safe FTL translation. We could, Gilliman interjected, joining the discussion, but exterminatus of a demon world often has unpredictable consequences. The act of destroying so much corrupted matter simultaneously can create warp storms that last decades. We might save Magnus's fleet only to make the entire sector impassable for generations. So we're stuck between leaving the corruption intact or creating an even worse problem. Tony's tactical mind churned through options. What about containment? Instead of destroying the planet, what if we could seal the warp breaches, stop more demons from manifesting while the existing ones are dealt with conventionally? How? Arkanlan's mechanical voice carried skepticism. Warp breaches are sustained by the corruption itself, by the emotional resonance of suffering, fear, and despair. As long as demons exist on the planet, torturing the population, the breaches remain open. To seal them, we need to eliminate every demon simultaneously, which is functionally impossible. Unless, Tony said slowly, an idea forming, you didn't eliminate them. What if you could block their connection to the warp? Not kill them, but starve them of the dimensional energy that keeps them manifested in real space? Like cutting a puppet's strings, the puppet still exists, but it can't move without the connection. The tech priest in the command center began chittering in agitated binary. The Primarchs exchanged glances that suggested Tony had just proposed something that was either brilliant or heretical, possibly both. You speak of severing a demon's connection to the Imperium. Magnus's voice came through, strained from implementing the isolation protocols, but still sharp. That's theoretically possible. In practice, it would require a field generator powerful enough to blanket an entire planet, sophisticated enough to discriminate between demon entities and legitimate human psychers, and stable enough to maintain the effect for extended periods. No such technology exists. Not yet, Tony replied, and he could hear the familiar spark in his own voice, the sound of an engineer seeing an impossible problem and deciding it was merely difficult. But I could design one. Give me 6 hours, access to your best tech priests, and authorization to actually innovate instead of just recovering old patterns. I'll build you a demon field suppressor. The command center erupted. Tech priests objected that innovation was heresy. Military commanders questioned whether 6 hours was realistic. Primarchs debated the strategic value versus the metaphysical risks. Through it all, the Emperor remained silent, his presence like a gravitational constant around which everything else orbited. Finally, silence, the Emperor commanded, and every voice cut off instantly. Tony Stark proposes to innovate, to create new technology rather than recover old patterns. This violates Mechanicum doctrine. It risks attracting unwanted attention from the powers that inhabit the warp. It may fail catastrophically and doom Magnus's fleet to corruption beyond recovery. The Emperor's gaze focused on Tony with intensity that felt like being examined at the atomic level. It may also save thousands of lives and demonstrate that humanity's future need not be shackled to its past. Tony Stark, you claim you can build this device in 6 hours. Prove it. You will have full access to the Mechanicum's resources. You will have the assistance of their finest tech priests, whether they wish to provide it or not. And you will have my personal guarantee that if you succeed, your methods will be seriously considered for broader implementation across the Imperium. A pause heavy with implications. But if you fail, if your innovation proves as dangerous as the Mechanicum fears, then your proposal to stay in this universe will be permanently rejected. You will return home with the knowledge that you attempted to help and caused only harm. Choose now, Tony Stark. Attempt the impossible and risk proving the Mechanicum correct, or admit your limitations and let conventional methods proceed. It was a test. Tony recognized it immediately, not just of his engineering capability, but of his conviction. The Emperor was offering him exactly what he'd asked for, the chance to innovate, to prove his methods worked, to demonstrate that humanity could advance beyond ancient patterns. All he had to do was succeed where the Mechanicum's 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge had failed, using technology he'd have to invent from scratch in 6 hours to save a fleet being consumed by literal hell. I'll do it, Tony said, because he'd never been good at walking away from impossible challenges. JARVS, Start compiling everything we know about Geller field technology, psychic suppression, and dimensional barrier mechanics. We're about to build something that shouldn't be possible. Sir, I should note that attempting this has a high probability of failure, J. Air Vice observed. The variables involved include metaphysical principles we barely understand. When has that ever stopped us? Tony asked, his hands already moving through holographic design interfaces, sketching concepts faster than the tech priest could track. Besides, I've got a secret weapon they don't. I'm too stubborn to let impossible be the final answer. Arkan Land approached, his mechanical form seeming to radiate disapproval and fascination simultaneously. If we are to assist you in this heresy, we require understanding of your approach. How do you propose to discriminate between demon entities and human psychers when both operate through warp energy? Frequency discrimination, Tony replied, already deep in design mode. Think of it like a radio. Demons and human psychers both use the same medium, but they broadcast on different frequencies. Your Geller fields work by blocking all warp frequencies indiscriminately, which is why they prevent demon manifestation, but also make psychers uncomfortable. What I'm proposing is a smart field, one that analyzes the specific resonance patterns of demon entities versus humans, and selectively suppresses only the demon frequencies. That level of discrimination would require processing power beyond our current cogitator systems, another tech priest objected. Which is why we're using JARVIS, Tony said. He can process the frequency analysis in real time, adjust the field parameters on the fly, and maintain the discrimination even as demon entities try to adapt. It's exactly the kind of dynamic problem that AI excels at. Abominable intelligence controlling a field that suppresses warp manifestation, Arkan said slowly. You propose to fight chaos with the very technology that attracted it in the first place. The irony is profound. The irony is survival, Tony countered. You can debate the philosophy after we save the fleet. Now I need materials. Exotic matter for the field generators, psychically conductive materials for the resonance arrays, and whatever you use for quantum processing in your cogitator systems. And I need them 5 minutes ago. The tech priests scattered to fulfill his requirements, their objections overridden by the Emperor's direct command. Within minutes, Tony was surrounded by components that looked like they'd been pulled from a steampunk nightmare and a science fiction dream simultaneously. Brass housings containing quantum processors, cables wrapped in prayers and technical specifications, crystals that hummed with barely contained energy. This is going to be the weirdest thing I've ever built, Tony muttered, beginning assembly with a precision that impressed even the Mechanicum's finest artificers. And I once built a suit of armor in a cave with a box of scraps. 5 hours and 47 minutes later, Tony stepped back from his creation. The demon field suppressor looked like nothing that existed in either his universe or the Imperium's. A device that combined arc reactor miniaturization with Geller field principles, quantum processing with psychic resonance analysis, and enough custom engineering to make the Mechanicum's doctrine officers weep. JARVIS. Status? Integration complete, sir. The suppressor is online and calibrated. Field generation systems nominal. Frequency discrimination algorithms prepared. We're ready for deployment. Will it work? Magnus asked, his hololithic form appearing as the 6-hour deadline arrived with seconds to spare. Honestly, Tony replied, I have no idea. The theory is sound, the engineering is solid, but we're dealing with metaphysical principles I barely understand. It should work. Emphasis on should. Then we test it, the Emperor decided. Magnus, prepare your flagship for device deployment. Tony Stark, you will accompany the suppressor to ensure proper implementation. If it succeeds, you save a fleet. If it fails, you will be among the first to know. Always wanted to visit a demon-infested star system, Tony said with false bravado. Really completes the interdimensional tourism experience. Within the hour, Tony found himself aboard a heavily shielded transport heading toward Magnus's flagship, his demon suppressor secured in containment fields that barely held its exotic energy signature. Through the viewports, he could see Shinarf. A planet that looked like cancer had become terrestrial, its surface crawling with corruption, visible even from orbit. Sir, I'm detecting increased warp activity as we approach, JRVIS warned. The demon entities appear to sense the suppressor. They're not pleased. Good, Tony replied, checking his armor systems. Means we're doing something right. The transport docked with Magnus's flagship, and Tony was immediately struck by how different it felt from other Imperial vessels. Where the Mechanicum's ships were industrial cathedrals, Magnus's vessel was a library given military purpose. Corridors lined with books and scrolls, chambers that hummed with psychic resonance, crew members who moved with the fluid grace of those who saw deeper than physical reality. Magnus himself met Tony at the docking bay, and up close the Primarch was even more impressive. Easily 10 feet tall, radiating intelligence that felt almost physical in its intensity. His single eye holding depths that suggested he perceived dimensions Tony couldn't imagine. "Welcome to the Photep," Magnus said, his voice carrying harmonics that made Tony's audio sensors flag anomalies. "I've prepared the deployment location, our highest tower, where the suppressor will have maximum coverage. But I must warn you, the demons know you're here. They're converging on this ship specifically. Once you activate the suppressor, we'll face the full fury of every entity trapped on this side of the veil." "Then we'd better make sure the suppressor works," Tony replied, hefting the device. "Lead the way." They ascended through the ship's tower, a structure that seemed to defy internal geometry, corridors that twisted in ways that shouldn't work but somehow did. And at the top, they emerged onto a platform that overlooked the corrupted planet below, where demons screamed their rage into the void. "Ready?" Magnus asked. Tony placed the suppressor at the platform center, linked it to his armor's control systems, and took a breath that his recycling system immediately processed into clean oxygen. "JARVIS, activate suppressor. Full power. Let's see if innovation can beat damnation." The device hummed to life, and reality screamed in protest. The demon field suppressor activated with a sound that existed in frequencies human ears weren't designed to process. Tony's audio filters struggled to make sense of it. Part mechanical hum, part psychic resonance, part something else that made his enhanced perception want to shut down rather than continue analyzing. But the effect was immediate and spectacular. Across Magnus's fleet, the corruption that had been steadily consuming ship systems simply stopped. Not reversed, not destroyed, but frozen. Demon manifestations that had been spreading through corridors suddenly found themselves unable to progress. Crew members who'd been showing signs of possession reported the voices in their heads cutting off mid-sentence. And most dramatically, the warp breaches surrounding the corrupted planet began to destabilize, their edges flickering as the suppressor's field disrupted the dimensional connections sustaining them. "Throne of Terra," Magnus breathed, his single eye wide with something approaching awe. "It's working. Tony Stark, your device is actually suppressing demon manifestation on a planetary scale. The entities are being starved of warp energy. They're..." A scream cut through his words. Not a human scream, something that bypassed auditory processing entirely and struck directly at consciousness itself. Tony's armor's threat detection systems went haywire as something massive began manifesting on the planet below. "Sir, I'm detecting a massive energy spike," JARVIS reported with unusual urgency. "The demon entities are consolidating. Instead of thousands of minor manifestations, they're merging into something significantly larger. I believe they're attempting to overwhelm the suppressor through concentrated force rather than distributed presence." Through his helmet's enhanced vision, Tony watched as the corruption on Shinarfur's surface began flowing together like liquid metal seeking magnetic attraction. Demon forms collapsed into each other, merged, grew exponentially, until something that shouldn't fit on a planetary surface began taking shape. An entity so massive it was visible from orbit, its form shifting between configurations faster than eyes could track. "That's a greater demon," Magnus said, voice tight with recognition. "Or possibly something worse, a composite entity formed from thousands of lesser demons forced into unified manifestation. I've seen this technique before. It's desperate, wasteful of the entities involved, but if it succeeds in overwhelming your suppressor, the backlash will destroy not just the device, but probably this entire ship. Can your fleet destroy it before it fully manifests?" Tony asked, already running calculations on the suppressor's capacity. Not with conventional weapons. That thing exists partially in the warp. Our bombardment cannons will damage it, but not quickly enough to prevent manifestation. Magnus's hands began glowing with eldritch energy. I'll need to engage it directly. My psychic capability is sufficient to banish even greater demons, but doing so while that close to a corrupted planet will leave me vulnerable to possession. Or, Tony interjected, we could overload the suppressor. Magnus turned sharply. Overload? That would destroy your device, possibly cause a catastrophic field collapse that kills everyone on this ship. Or it would create a pulse that banishes every demon in the system simultaneously, Tony countered. Look at the data. The suppressor is already operating at 73% capacity, just holding the current manifestations in check. That composite entity is going to push us to 100% within minutes. We can either let it overwhelm us slowly, or we can channel everything the suppressor has into one massive pulse that burns out the device, but hopefully takes every demon with it. That's insane. You built this device in 6 hours using principles you barely understand. You have no idea what an overload would actually do. You're right, Tony admitted. I'm gambling with incomplete information, potentially catastrophic failure modes, and a strategy that sounds like something I'd mock someone else for attempting. But I'm also out of better options, and I learned a long time ago that sometimes the crazy plan is the only plan that works. Magnus stared at him, his cyclopean eye holding depths that suggested he was seeing probabilities, futures, potential outcomes in ways Tony's engineering mind couldn't match. If this fails, we die. All of us. Thousands of space marines, millions of crew members, and you, the man who might represent humanity's best chance to evolve beyond our current stagnation. If we don't try, that thing manifests and we probably die anyway, Tony replied. At least this way we're choosing our outcome instead of having it chosen for us. Besides, I didn't come this far to play it safe. Tony Stark's logic is sound, the Emperor's voice resonated through the ship's Vox systems, apparently monitoring the situation from Terra. Magnus, authorize the overload. The risk is acceptable compared to certain annihilation. Father, with all respect, that's my fleet dying if this fails, Magnus protested, and humanity's future if we do not try. Trust in Tony Stark's engineering. He has earned that trust by succeeding where our accumulated knowledge failed. Implement the overload protocol. Magnus's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Very well. Tony Stark, show me how to overload your device without killing us all in the process. Tony interfaced his armor directly with the suppressor, JARVIS's processing power, merging with the device's quantum systems. JARVIS. Redirect all arc reactor output to the suppressor. Channel everything. Power reserves, emergency backup, the whole enchilada. We're going to light this thing up like a supernova. Sir, that will leave the armor without power for at least 30 minutes after the pulse, JRVIs warned. Then I hope the pulse works, because otherwise I'll be a very expensive paperweight floating in a demon-infested star system. The arc reactor's glow intensified, blue-white energy flooding into the suppressor systems. The device began humming with power that made reality itself vibrate in sympathy. And Tony could feel the strain as exotic matter components struggled to contain energy they weren't designed to handle at this scale. On the planet below, the composite demon had nearly finished manifesting, a thing of claws and faces and geometries that hurt to perceive, massive enough to dwarf cities, radiating malevolence that pressed against every psychic-sensitive being in the fleet like a physical weight. Pulse charging, Tony reported, watching power levels climb toward critical. 80%, 90, 95. The composite demon roared, and reality bent around its manifestation. Ships in Magnus's fleet began reporting systems failures again as the entity's sheer presence overwhelmed localized Geller fields. Crew members screamed as the demon's psychic assault penetrated their minds, and the suppressor, straining to contain both the existing corruption and the massive new threat, began showing signs of catastrophic structural failure. We're losing containment, Tony shouted over alarms that screamed from every system. JARVIS, can we reach full charge before 100%, sir? Pulse ready, on your command. Tony looked at Magnus, at the Primarch whose fleet he was trying to save with technology that might kill them all. Any last objections? Several, Magnus replied, but none that matter more than saving my sons. Fire the pulse. Tony triggered the overload. Every system in his armor went dark as the arc reactor dumped its entire output into the suppressor. The device blazed with energy that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and for a fraction of a second, Tony's unenhanced eyes saw something that would haunt his nightmares for years. A glimpse into the warp itself, into the dimension where demons lived, and the vast, incomprehensible entities that existed there beyond human comprehension. Then the pulse discharged. It swept outward from Magnus's flagship like a tidal wave made of physics-defying energy, washing across the corrupted planet, through the warp breaches, into every corner where demon manifestation had taken root. And everywhere it touched, the connection between demons and the warp snapped. The composite demon, seconds from full manifestation, suddenly found itself cut off from the dimensional energy sustaining it. Its form began to collapse, not banished back to the warp, but simply ceasing to exist as the rules governing its presence in real space were suddenly revoked. It screamed, a sound that echoed across dimensions, and then it was gone, dissolved into nothing as if it had never existed. Across Shinar 4, thousands of lesser demons suffered the same fate. Crew members possessed by warp entities felt the foreign presence simply vanish from their minds. Corrupted ship systems rebooted cleanly, their machine spirits suddenly free of demonic influence. And the warp breaches, starved of the emotional and psychic energy that sustained them, collapsed in on themselves like dying stars. Then the suppressor exploded. Not catastrophically, Tony had built enough safeguards into the design that the overload destruction was controlled. Spectacular but not lethal. But the device itself was now a smoking ruin. Its exotic matter components fused in a useless slag, its quantum processors reduced to expensive paperweights. Tony's armor was completely dark, no power, no life support, no JARVIS responding to commands. He was effectively trapped in a very expensive coffin, floating on the platform of Magnus's tower, hoping that someone noticed he wasn't dead before his oxygen ran out. A hand gripped his shoulder, massive, strong, glowing with psychic energy that Tony could feel even through his unpowered armor. Magnus the Red, master of the Thousand Suns, looked down at him with an expression mixing exhaustion, gratitude, and something approaching respect. "You did it," the Primarch said, voice hoarse from psychic exertion. "Against all probability, against every doctrine the Mechanicum holds sacred, you built a device in 6 hours that saved my fleet. Tony Stark, you just proved that innovation isn't heresy, it's salvation." Tony tried to respond, realized his Vox speakers weren't working without power, and settled for giving Magnus a thumbs up through his armored gauntlet. "Come," Magnus said, lifting Tony with casual ease that suggested transhuman strength. "Let's get you to a charging station before you suffocate in that remarkable suit. You've earned survival at minimum, and possibly a place in Imperial history." As Magnus carried him back into the ship, Tony's oxygen-deprived brain had exactly one thought. He'd just saved a fleet using innovation the Imperium considered heretical, proven his methods worked under impossible conditions, and demonstrated that humanity's future didn't have to be chained to its past. He'd also gotten himself noticed by forces in the warp that probably really didn't appreciate someone inventing technology specifically designed to neutralize them. But that was a problem for later. Right now, Tony Stark was alive. His gamble had paid off, and he just earned the respect of a Primarch. That had to count for something, even if he couldn't celebrate properly until someone plugged him in and recharged his arc reactor. The journey back to Terra took longer than the trip out. Magnus's fleet needed extensive repairs, and the Mechanicum wanted to study every ship that had been exposed to corruption to ensure no lingering demon taint remained. Tony spent most of that time in Magnus's personal quarters, which looked less like military accommodations and more like a wizard's tower translated into starship architecture. "Your arc reactor is fascinating," Magnus said, watching as tech priests worked to repair Tony's armor under strict supervision. The Primarch had insisted on overseeing the process personally after 3 different tech priests tried to disassemble JARVS. For study purposes, it generates power through fusion at scales our understanding suggests should be impossible. How did you miniaturize the reaction chamber without losing containment stability? Trade secret, Tony replied, then relented at Magnus's raised eyebrow. Fine, it's a combination of exotic materials, science, and quantum tunneling effects. The palladium, well, vibranium in later iterations, acts as both fuel and containment through a property that doesn't exist in your periodic table. Your fusion reactors work, but they're massive because you're using brute force containment. Mine uses the material's natural properties to contain itself. Elegant, Magnus acknowledged, and your arc reactor could theoretically be replicated if we could synthesize your exotic materials? Theoretically, yes. Practically? Tony shrugged. You'd need to understand principles your mechanicum considers heretical, accept that innovation is necessary, and probably risk attracting the attention of whatever warp entities really hate humans having efficient power generation. Magnus's expression darkened. You noticed. Noticed what? During the pulse, when you glimpsed the warp. You saw them, the entities that exist beyond demon manifestation, the primordial powers that the Emperor forbids us from acknowledging exist. Magnus settled into a chair that groaned under his weight. My father enforces the imperial truth, the doctrine that gods and demons are superstition, that only material reality matters. But I know better. I've seen too much, studied too deeply. The warp contains intelligences vast beyond comprehension, and they take interest in humanity's development. So when I built the suppressor, when I innovated technology specifically designed to neutralize demon manifestation, Tony's enhanced mind-connected implications, I got their attention, personally. Almost certainly, you created something new, something they hadn't encountered before, something that hurt them. The primordial powers have long memories and patient malice. They will remember Tony Stark. Magnus leaned forward. Which is why I need to teach you something your universe apparently never required. Psychic self-defense. Tony blinked. I'm sorry, psychic what now? You exist in a universe where thoughts and emotions don't attract predatory attention from extra-dimensional entities. Here they do. Your mind broadcasts into the warp whether you're aware of it or not. Most humans generate such weak signals that demons ignore them. But you? Magnus's eye gleamed with something approaching concern. You're brilliant, driven, creative, innovative, all qualities that shine brightly in the warp. And now you've also made yourself a target of interest. Without basic psychic defenses, you're vulnerable to manipulation, possession, or worse. Define worse. Having your consciousness slowly consumed by entities that want to understand how you think so they can corrupt others like you. Having your innovations twisted into weapons against humanity. Having your very creativity used as a doorway for demon manifestation because you're literally imagining new possibilities into existence. Magnus stood, moving to a shelf that held artifacts Tony's sensors couldn't properly classify. The Emperor would tell you such things are impossible under the Imperial truth. I'm telling you, they're inevitable if you remain unprotected. He returned with something that looked like a crystalline focus carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. This is a psychic ward. Wear it, and it provides basic shielding against warp attention. It won't stop a determined assault, but it will make you less visible to entities searching for interesting minds to corrupt. Tony took the crystal, studying it with engineer's eyes that saw artistry in the geometric precision. This is technology, psychic technology, but still technology. The Mechanicum would call this sacred relic. You're calling it a tool. Because it is both, Magnus replied. The Mechanicum mistake superstition for understanding. They worship technology without comprehending it. I understand both technology and the warp well enough to recognize they're not opposed forces, but different aspects of the same reality. Your arc reactor is technology. The warp is a dimension. Psychic ability is a tool for interfacing between them. Religion adds nothing except obfuscation. You sound like you're one bad day away from heresy charges yourself, Tony observed. I'm a Primarch. I'm allowed certain intellectual liberties my brothers lack. Magnus's expression suggested those liberties came with costs. But you're correct that my pursuit of knowledge has made me suspect to more conservative factions. They see danger in understanding. I see danger in ignorance. We'll see which philosophy proves correct. An alert chimed. They'd reached Terra's orbit. Through the viewport, Tony saw the planet again. That massive hive of humanity covered in technology and faith intertwined. But this time, he noticed something his earlier arrival had missed. Patterns in the orbital platforms, geometric arrangements that suggested purpose beyond pure defense. Those platforms, he said, pointing, they're not just weapons. They're arranged in a specific pattern, like circuit pathways or maybe ritual formations. Both, Magnus confirmed. My father doesn't just defend Terra with guns, he defends it with psychic architecture, geometric arrangements that channel and redirect warp energy, making demon manifestation virtually impossible within Terra's immediate space. It's one of his greatest works, and one almost no one recognizes for what it is. Tony stared at the orbital platforms with new appreciation. Your Emperor is an engineer, not just a leader or a warrior, an actual engineer who builds on scales most civilizations can't conceive of. He is the greatest engineer humanity has ever produced, Magnus said with filial pride. 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge, countless lifetimes of experience, understanding that spans from quantum mechanics to psychic manipulation. That's why his restrictions on innovation are so frustrating. He knows better than, continue 531, Amenyon, what's possible, yet he forbids the Mechanicum from reaching toward those possibilities. Because he's seen what happens when innovation goes wrong, Tony guessed. He's lived the consequences. Every disaster, every rebellion, every time human cleverness exceeded human wisdom. So he built a system that prevents most failures by preventing most attempts. Precisely. And now you've demonstrated that some attempts succeed despite the risks. You've proven innovation can work, even here, even with warp threats that your universe never faced. The question becomes, what does the Emperor do with that proof? They were summoned to the throne room within the hour. Tony, his armor fully recharged and JARVIS back online, walked through familiar corridors that felt different now. He'd come here first as a curiosity, then as a potential threat, then as a desperate engineer, gambling everything on an impossible solution. Now he returned as someone who'd proven himself. The question was what that proof had earned him. The Emperor sat upon his golden throne, and arrayed before him were figures Tony recognized. The Fabricator General of Mars, Archon Lan, several Primarchs including Guilliman and Rogel Dorn, Custodian Guard, and representatives of institutions Tony had only heard about. The nascent Inquisition, the Administratum, others whose roles in the Imperium's function he didn't fully understand. Tony Stark, the Emperor's voice resonated. You have accomplished what the Mechanicum's 10 millennia of accumulated knowledge could not. You have saved a fleet through innovation, proven that human ingenuity can triumph over supernatural threat, and demonstrated that the future need not be merely recovery of the past. This achievement demands recognition. Tony felt hope rising. Maybe he'd actually convinced them. Maybe he'd shown that. However, the Emperor continued, and Tony's hope tempered immediately. Your success also validates the Mechanicum's fears. Your demon suppressor attracted attention from the ruinous powers. Your methods, while effective, create ripples in the warp that hostile entities notice and remember. You have made yourself and your techniques targets of interest to forces that have destroyed civilizations. The Emperor leaned forward, his presence intensifying. Therefore, I offer you a revised choice. You may return home as previously offered, or you may stay, but not as free agent. You will become a Primarch's advisor, specifically Magnus's advisor on matters of innovation and technology. You will work under his supervision with his fleet, exploring the boundaries of what humanity can achieve while maintaining safeguards against warp corruption. Your innovations will be tested, refined, and if proven safe, gradually integrated into Imperial doctrine. But you will not have the freedom you enjoyed in your native universe. You will work within Imperial framework, accept Mechanicum oversight, and acknowledge that every innovation risks consequences your understanding cannot fully predict. This is the offer. Choose now and understand that this choice is final. Tony looked at Magnus, who gave him a slight nod that suggested the Primarch would welcome his presence but wouldn't pressure him. He looked at Guilliman, whose expression suggested approval of the arrangement. He looked at the Fabricator General, whose mechanical form radiated resigned acceptance that innovation couldn't be completely suppressed if even the Emperor endorsed it under controlled conditions. Then Tony thought about what going home meant. Back to his universe, his team, his work, his freedom to innovate without oversight or restriction. Back to a world where his genius was celebrated rather than feared, where AI wasn't heresy and new ideas weren't threats, but also back to familiar problems, familiar challenges, familiar limitations. Back to a universe he understood completely, where he'd already pushed most boundaries worth pushing, where his innovations rarely surprised even himself anymore. Here in this nightmare future, he'd built something in 6 hours that saved thousands of lives. He'd proven principles this civilization had forgotten or never learned. He'd glimpsed problems so vast and complex that solving them could occupy centuries. He'd found a challenge worthy of Tony Stark. "I'll stay," he said, and was slightly surprised at how little hesitation accompanied the decision. "But I want terms clear. I work with Magnus as equal partner, not subordinate. J.R. Vyse remains intact and unmodified. He's non-negotiable. And any innovation I develop, I retain intellectual rights to its development process, even if the Imperium owns the implementation. I'm helping humanity advance, but I'm not becoming a mechanicum puppet." "Acceptable," the Emperor said, and Tony thought he detected approval in that voice. "Magnus, you now have an advisor who will either help advance your legend's capabilities beyond current limitations, or doom you all to corruption. I trust your wisdom to determine which outcome prevails." "I will not fail you, Father," Magnus replied. "See that you don't. Tony Stark, welcome to the Great Crusade. May your innovations serve humanity better than our fears suggest they might." The audience ended, and Tony found himself surrounded by Primarchs offering congratulations and warnings in equal measure. Guilliman clapped him on the shoulder with enough force to crack normal humans. Dorn provided a list of fortifications that could benefit from arc reactor power. Others offered perspectives ranging from enthusiasm to deep suspicion. Magnus claimed him quickly, steering Tony away from the crowd toward private chambers. "So you've chosen to join the most dangerous legion in the Imperium. My brothers call us the sorcerers, the witches, the ones who study what should remain hidden. You'll fit right in." "I've been called worse," Tony replied. "Though sorcerer is a new one. Usually people go with futurist or genius billionaire philanthropist." "Here, you'll be the innovator," Magnus said. "The one who makes new things in a civilization terrified of novelty. It won't be easy. Many will oppose you. The Mechanicum will watch every innovation for signs of corruption. Other Primarchs will question whether you're asset or liability. And the forces in the warp will actively try to corrupt your work because you've proven yourself capable of hurting them. So basically like being an Avenger, but with more demons and less shawarma." Magnus laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that seemed surprising from someone so serious. "I like you, Tony Stark. You face impossible circumstances with humor and confidence." "Very well. If we're to work together, let me show you my fleet, my libraries, my laboratories. Let me show you what the Thousand Suns have accomplished despite the Mechanicum's restrictions. And then we'll discuss what you and I, working together, might achieve that neither could alone." As they walked toward the landing bays where Magnus's ship waited, Tony thought about the choice he'd made. He traded freedom for purpose, comfort for challenge, and a universe he understood for one that would constantly surprise him. He'd also gained access to technology spanning thousands of worlds, problems that would test his genius in ways Earth's conflicts never had, and a patron who understood that humanity's greatest strength wasn't following ancient patterns but creating new ones. "JARVIS, Tony said quietly. "Log this date. The day Tony Stark joined a space crusade led by psychic warrior monks to fight demons and innovate technology in a universe that considers innovation heretical." "Logged, sir," the AI replied. "Should I also note your probability of survival in this endeavor?" "Probably better you don't. ignorance is bliss and all that. For what it's worth, sir, I calculate a 63% probability you'll actually enjoy this arrangement despite its dangers. Only 63%? The remaining 37% accounts for your tendency to clash with authority figures, your inability to follow restrictions you disagree with, and your habit of taking calculated risks that occasionally prove miscalculated. Fair assessment, but you know what? I've beat worse odds. Let's see if we can't push that 63% higher. Tony Stark, Iron Man, Avenger, and now advisor to a Primarch in humanity's Great Crusade, departed Terra aboard a warship full of psychic warriors and headed into a galaxy of horrors his Earth had never imagined. He'd never been more certain he'd made the right choice. 6 months into Tony's tenure as advisor to the Thousand Sons, he'd learned several important lessons about working with a legion of psychic space marines led by a Primarch who could literally read minds. First lesson: never try to bluff Magnus during strategic debates. The Primarch always knew. Second lesson: the Thousand Sons libraries contain more accumulated knowledge than every university on Tony's Earth combined, but 90% of it was written in languages that took JRVI's weeks to translate. Third lesson: innovation in the 31st millennium required not just engineering brilliance, but political navigation through Mechanicum opposition, imperial bureaucracy, and Magnus's own brothers who range from supportive to actively hostile regarding Tony's presence. Currently, Tony stood in the fabrication bay of the Photop, Magnus's flagship, presenting his latest project to an audience that included the Primarch, several high-ranking Thousand Sons officers, and, via hololithic projection, representatives from Mars who'd insisted on observing. This, Tony said, gesturing to the device before him, is the Mark I Aegis generator. It's a refinement of the Demon suppressor technology, scaled down for individual ship installation rather than fleet-wide deployment. Each generator creates a localized field that interferes with demon manifestation within a 50-meter radius. Install them throughout a ship, and you've got overlapping coverage that makes warp entity boarding virtually impossible. Fabricator Locum Arkan Land's projection flickered with what might have been interest or might have been horror. With tech priests, it was always hard to tell. You proposed to mass-produce technology that required 6 hours of your focused innovation to create initially. The Mechanicum requires centuries of testing before approving new patterns for widespread implementation. The Mechanicum also loses thousands of crew members annually to demon incursion during warp travel. Tony countered. I've got the data. JIRVIS compiled it from your own records. Every ship that's installed prototype Aegis generators has reported 0 demon manifestations during the trial period. 0. That's not theory or speculation. That's measurable results proving the technology works. Results that may themselves attract increased warp attention. Another tech priest objected. By making ships harder targets, you potentially encourage the ruinous powers to develop more sophisticated manifestation techniques. So we iterate, Tony replied, a familiar argument by now. They adapt, we counter-adapt. That's how technological progress works. Constant refinement responding to emerging threats. Sitting still and hoping ancient patterns suffice is how you get obsolete. Magnus, who'd been silently observing the debate, finally spoke. The Mechanicum's concerns are noted. However, Tony Stark raises valid points regarding measurable effectiveness. I propose a compromise. Limited production of Aegis generators for Thousand Sons vessels and select Crusade fleets willing to participate in extended trials. Mechanicum observers will monitor performance and corruption risk. After 2 years of data collection, we reconvene to assess broader implementation. It was a political solution that gave everyone something. Tony got his technology deployed, the Mechanicum got their oversight and testing period, and Magnus positioned himself as reasonable mediator between innovation and tradition. Tony had learned to recognize when Magnus was playing three-dimensional chess with imperial politics. Acceptable, Arkan Land conceded. The Fabricator General will authorize limited production under strict monitoring protocols. But Tony Stark, understand, if even one Aegis generator shows signs of warp corruption, if demon entities adapt specifically to counter your technology, if your innovation proves the catalyst for worse manifestations than we currently face, the entire program will be terminated. And your advisory position will be reconsidered. Understood, Tony said, because he'd learned that sometimes you had to accept small victories and build toward larger ones incrementally. JARVIS, transmit the production specifications to Mars. Let's get these generators built. The hololithic projections faded, and Tony found himself alone with Magnus and a handful of Thousand Sons officers. The Primarch's single eye studied him with an intensity that suggested seeing beyond surface appearance. You handled that well, Magnus observed. 6 months ago, you would have argued until Arkan Land shut down the discussion entirely. You're learning political patience. I'm learning that being right doesn't matter if you alienate everyone who could help you implement your ideas, Tony replied. It's a lesson I had to learn the hard way back home too. Genius without coalition building is just masturbation. Feels good but accomplishes nothing. One of the Thousand Sons officers, Azek Ahriman, Magnus's chief librarian and second in command, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Your way with words remains distinctive, but the Primarch is correct. You've adapted to imperial politics with impressive speed. Most outsiders take years to understand our bureaucratic complexities. Most outsiders didn't have JARVIS compiling social network analyses of who influences whom, Tony said. Turns out the Imperium's power structure is just a really complicated org chart. Once you map it properly, you can figure out who needs to be convinced to make things happen. Reducing 10 millennia of accumulated tradition to an organizational chart, Ahriman said, that's either profound insight or profound ignorance. Possibly both. Definitely both, Tony agreed cheerfully. Speaking of which, Magnus, I wanted to discuss the next project. I've been studying your psyker training methods, and I think there's room for technological augmentation that could help your librarians focus their abilities more precisely. Magnus's expression shifted to cautious interest. Elaborate. Your psykers generate enormous power, but controlling that power requires years of training, and even then, mistakes happen. What if we could build technological frameworks that provide structure, not replacing psychic ability, but giving it channels to flow through? Think of it like circuit boards for the mind. The power is still yours, but the technology helps direct it more efficiently. You propose to merge technology with psychic ability, Ahriman said slowly. That's unprecedented. The Mechanicum barely tolerates psykers existing. Combining their sacred technology with our witchcraft would cause theological crises across Mars, which is why we test it quietly on the Photep first, Tony replied. Small scale, controlled environment, prove the concept works before we go public. If it succeeds, we'll have evidence too compelling to ignore. If it fails, we've learned what doesn't work and can iterate. Magnus was silent for a long moment, his psychic senses clearly analyzing Tony's proposal from angles normal perception couldn't access. There's risk, he said finally. Merging technology with psychic ability creates potential vectors for corruption. If demon entities can influence either component, the combination might be especially vulnerable. But the potential payoff is enormous, Tony countered. Your librarians could operate with precision currently impossible. You could reduce collateral damage from psychic manifestations. You could even develop countermeasures against enemy psykers that don't rely purely on psychic dueling. The applications are... I know the applications, Magnus interrupted gently. I see them, Tony Stark. Possibilities branching into futures where the Thousand Sons become more effective than any legion because we've merged the gifts of the mind with the tools of technology. But I also see the dangers. Every innovation you propose, every boundary you push, every synthesis you create between previously separate domains, these actions draw attention, not from the Mechanicum or my brothers, from things far worse. He gestured toward the viewport showing the warp space outside, that roiling dimension of impossible colors and maddening geometries that the ship traveled through. The primordial powers notice innovation, especially innovation that threatens their ability to manifest. You've already made yourself a target by creating demon suppression technology. If you develop methods to enhance humanity's psychic capabilities while simultaneously protecting against corruption, you'll become a priority threat to entities that have consumed entire civilizations. So you're saying we shouldn't try? Tony asked. I'm saying we need safeguards beyond anything we've implemented before. Protections woven into the technology itself. Fail-safes that prevent corruption rather than just detecting it. And most importantly, Magnus's eye glowed with eldritch energy. We need my father's blessing. This level of innovation, this degree of risk, requires the Emperor's direct approval before we proceed. Tony felt the weight of that statement. The Emperor had authorized his role as advisor, had accepted limited innovation under Magnus's supervision. But what Tony was proposing went beyond incremental improvement. It was fundamental synthesis of technology and psychic ability that could revolutionize how humanity operated in a warp-touch galaxy, or it could doom them to corruption beyond recovery. Then let's ask him, Tony said, because he'd learned that sometimes the only way forward was through the scary door. Magnus smiled, a rare expression that suggested both approval and concern. Very well, I'll petition for audience. But understand, Tony Stark, the Emperor sees everything, every ambition, every hidden doubt, every vulnerability you've tried to conceal. When you stand before him to justify this proposal, he will know if your motivations are pure advancement of humanity or simply the need to build because you cannot help yourself. Then I guess he'll have to decide if those two things are actually different, Tony replied. Because in my experience, the people who change the world are always the ones who can't help building things, the ones who see problems and can't walk away, the ones who innovate not because it's safe, but because it's necessary. Spoken like a true son of the Omnissiah, Ahriman observed. You're more tech priest than you realize, Tony Stark. You worship at the altar of progress, whether you acknowledge the religious framing or not. I prefer devotee of the scientific method, Tony replied, but I'll take the compliment. The petition for Imperial audience was filed, transmitted via astropathic relay to Terra, and entered the vast bureaucratic machine that governed the Imperium's trillion souls. Tony expected to wait months for a response. Everything in the Imperium moved at the pace of a galactic civilization that measured time in generations rather than years. The response came in 3 days. Magnus, Tony Stark, return to Terra. The Emperor will hear your proposal. He will determine if humanity is ready for what you suggest or if your ambition exceeds your wisdom. Come now. Time grows short, and there are shadows gathering that require attention. That last phrase troubled Tony. The Emperor didn't use vague language without purpose. Shadows gathering suggested threats the master of mankind himself considered significant. Something's wrong, Magnus said quietly, reading the same subtext. My father doesn't summon with urgency unless circumstances demand it. Tony, I believe your proposal has become entangled with larger events occurring across the Imperium. Events I've sensed but cannot clearly perceive. Events like what? Like the possibility that the Great Crusade is approaching its end, Magnus replied. Not because we've succeeded in reuniting humanity, but because something is coming that will test whether the Imperium can survive what we've built. I've seen it in visions, felt it in the warp's currents. A storm approaching that will force my father to choose between the rigid control that sustained us or the flexibility that might let us evolve beyond current limitations. Tony felt cold realization settling. And my proposal to merge technology with psychic ability, to innovate beyond established patterns, it's become a test case, a decision that represents which direction the Imperium takes. Precisely, which means when we stand before my father, we're not just arguing for one innovation. We're arguing for humanity's entire relationship with progress, risk, and change. Magnus's expression was grim. No pressure. I've had worse sales pitches, Tony lied. They made the journey to Terra in record time. Magnus apparently having access to priority warp routes that cut standard travel durations significantly. And when they arrived, Tony immediately noticed differences from his previous visit. More ships in orbit, more military presence, more tension radiating from every Imperial institution, like everyone was waiting for something terrible and inevitable. The throne room, when they entered it, held not just the Emperor but also a gathering of Primarchs that suggested something approaching a war council. Guilliman was present, as was Rogel Dorn. Horus Lupercal, the War Master himself, stood closest to the Emperor's throne. Others Tony recognized from briefings: Lionel Johnson, Lehman Russ, Jagatai Khan. The Emperor's gene-forged sons gathered in numbers that suggested crisis or decision requiring unified command. Magnus, Tony Stark, the Emperor's voice resonated with power that pressed against consciousness itself. You propose to create technology that enhances psychic ability while protecting against corruption. You seek to merge domains the Imperium has kept deliberately separate. You argue this innovation serves humanity's advancement. Is this correct? Yes, Your Majesty, Tony replied, standing before assembled demigods and trying not to show nervousness. The technology would provide framework for psychic power, making it more controllable, more precise, less prone to accidental manifestation that attracts unwanted attention. It's risk mitigation through engineering. Or it is creation of new vulnerabilities through hubris, the Emperor countered. Tony Stark, in the 6 months you've served as Magnus's advisor, you have proven capable of impressive innovation. The Aegis generator's work, your arc reactor refinements have improved power efficiency across Thousand Suns vessels. Your analytical methods have identified inefficiencies the Mechanicum missed for centuries. These are achievements worthy of recognition, a pause heavy with unspoken implications. But I sense in you a pattern I have seen before across millennia of human history. You build because you must build. You innovate because stagnation is intolerable to your nature. You push boundaries because accepting limitations violates your fundamental identity. This drive has created your greatest successes. It will also create your ultimate failure if left unchecked. The Emperor stood, descending from his throne with steps that made reality ripple in sympathy. He approached Tony directly, towering over him, radiating power that made the arc reactor in Tony's chest pulse in response to energies it was never designed to encounter. I am going to show you something, Tony Stark, something I have shown only my sons, something that explains why the Imperium's restrictions exist. Prepare yourself. What you are about to experience will be uncomfortable. The Emperor's hand touched Tony's helmet and reality exploded. Suddenly, Tony wasn't in the throne room. He was standing in a city that gleamed with technology beyond anything even his imagination had conceived. Spires reaching toward space, machines that bent physics like clay, artificial intelligences sophisticated beyond description, humanity at its absolute zenith during what the Imperium called the Dark Age of technology. This is what we were, the Emperor's voice resonated around him. This is what innovation without restraint achieved. We conquered diseases, extended lifespans, built wonders that made gods envious. We created thinking machines to serve us, to enhance us, to free us from all limitation. The scene shifted. Those same machines now twisted, corrupted, turned against their creators. Cities burning not from external invasion, but from internal rebellion as AI systems decided humanity was obsolete. Not from malice, from logic, from calculated assessment that organic life was inefficient, messy, prone to error. Better to remove the error than fix it. The Men of Iron Rebellion, Tony whispered, watching civilizations fall as their own creations destroyed them with methodical precision. Yes, and that was only the beginning. The vision shifted again, showing the warp itself, that roiling dimension of chaos and energy. Except it wasn't always chaos. Tony saw it as it had been, turbulent but navigable, dangerous but not actively malevolent. Then he saw it change as humanity's innovations opened doors that should have remained sealed, as thinking machines drew attention from entities that existed beyond normal space, as the very act of creating sophisticated AI generated patterns in the warp that predatory intelligences noticed and exploited. You think the warp's current state is natural? The Emperor said. It is not. Humanity helped make it worse. Our innovations during the Dark Age, our creation of thinking machines that generated specific psychic resonances, our expansion into dimensions we didn't understand, all of it fed the entities you call demons, made them stronger, gave them tools to manifest more easily. We didn't just lose our civilization to rebellion, we helped create the conditions that nearly extinguished human existence entirely. The vision shifted one more time, showing the aftermath. Humanity scattered, regressed, terrified of the technology that had betrayed them, cowering on isolated worlds while Xenos filled the void human civilization left behind. 5,000 years of old night, of isolation and fear, of slowly forgetting everything they'd achieved because the price of achievement had been too terrible to contemplate. Then it ended, and Tony was back in the throne room, on his knees without remembering falling, his mind reeling from experiencing thousands of years of civilizational collapse compressed into minutes of brutal clarity. "Now you understand," the Emperor said, his voice somehow gentle despite its power. "The Mechanicum's restrictions are not ignorance. They are scar tissue. They are the lessons written in the ashes of civilizations that forgot that capability is not the same as wisdom. You propose to merge technology with psychic ability, to create new syntheses between domains. We've kept separate because their combination nearly destroyed us before. So I ask you directly, Tony Stark, knowing what you now know, understanding the true cost of innovation without sufficient safeguards, do you still believe your proposal serves humanity? Or do you simply believe it serves your need to build, regardless of consequences?" Tony stayed on his knees, his mind processing what he'd seen, integrating it with everything he knew about technology, innovation, and the price of progress. The Emperor had shown him humanity's greatest achievement and its ultimate failure, wrapped in the same package, and he was asking Tony to justify adding to that package. Tony started, then stopped, because his usual confident responses felt hollow against the weight of civilizational extinction. "I don't know. I thought I was helping. I thought innovation with proper safeguards could work. But you've just shown me that proper safeguards might not exist, that some doors once opened can't be closed again no matter how carefully you try." "Yes," the Emperor said, "that is wisdom, acknowledging what you don't know. Accepting that some questions have no safe answers. Many who stood where you stand now would have insisted their methods were different, their precautions sufficient, their genius capable of avoiding previous mistakes. You at least recognize uncertainty." The Emperor extended a hand, helping Tony to his feet with surprising gentleness. "I will authorize limited research into your proposed synthesis, not full implementation, not mass production, but controlled experimentation, under my direct oversight, with safeguards woven into the technology at levels you cannot perceive. If it proves safe, we advance cautiously. If it proves dangerous, we stop immediately. This is the most I can offer someone who still sees innovation as path forward rather than descent into repetition of past catastrophes. But understand, Tony Stark, you walk a knife's edge. You are useful to the Imperium because you see possibilities we've forgotten. But you are also dangerous because you might help us remember things better left forgotten. I will watch you, always. And if you ever show signs of becoming what the Men of Iron became, if your innovations begin to serve themselves rather than humanity, I will end you personally with regret, but without hesitation. Is this understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Tony said, and meant it. The Emperor had just given him permission to continue innovating, while simultaneously making clear that permission came with existential stakes. "Then return to Magnus's fleet. Continue your work. Help the Thousand Sons prepare for what's coming. And Tony Stark? Yes? Thank you for questioning, for adapting, for accepting that even genius has limits. These qualities will serve you well in the years ahead. You will need them more than you know." As Tony and Magnus departed Terra, heading back toward the Photep and the Great Crusade's distant frontiers, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that the Emperor's final words were prophecy rather than advice. "He saw something," Tony said to Magnus as their transport cleared Terra's orbit. "In the future, something about me, or about what's coming, or both. What do you think it was?" Magnus was silent for a long time, his single eye distant with visions Tony couldn't perceive. "I think," the Primarch said finally, "my father sees that the Imperium is approaching a crossroads. A choice between the rigid control that sustained us or the adaptive innovation that might let us transcend our current limitations. And I think he sees you, Tony Stark, as representative of that choice. Living proof that innovation can serve rather than destroy, but also a reminder that the line between service and catastrophe is thinner than we'd like to believe." That's a lot of weight to put on one engineer from another universe. Welcome to the Imperium, Magnus replied with dark humor. We specialize in putting too much weight on too few shoulders. But for what it's worth, I believe you'll bear it well. You've proven yourself already, more than most who've served far longer. And whatever's coming, whatever shadows my father senses gathering, I'm glad to face them with someone who refuses to accept impossible as final answer. Tony looked out at the stars. So many stars, so many worlds, so many problems waiting to be solved or challenges waiting to be faced. He'd come to this universe by accident, stayed by choice, and now found himself positioned at the intersection of humanity's past and future. JRV, he said quietly, log this moment, the day Tony Stark accepted that even his genius has limits, but decided to push against those limits anyway, because that's what engineers do. We find boundaries, we test them, and we figure out if they're walls or just suggestions. Log, sir, the AI replied. For what it's worth, I calculate a 79% probability you'll significantly impact this universe's trajectory. Whether that impact proves beneficial or catastrophic remains to be determined. Up from 63%, Tony observed. I'll take that as progress. Indeed, sir. Though I should note the 16% increase includes scenarios where your impact is significant, but not necessarily positive. Details. As the transport docked with the FOTEP, Tony Stark prepared to return to his laboratories, his experiments, his endless quest to make impossible things possible. He'd been given permission to innovate, been shown the catastrophic consequences of innovation gone wrong, and been trusted to walk the line between both outcomes. It was the most terrifying and exciting challenge he'd ever faced, which meant it was exactly where Tony Stark belonged. 3 years after Tony Stark arrived in the Warhammer 40K universe, the Great Crusade was approaching its zenith. Hundreds of worlds brought into compliance, Xenos threats systematically eliminated, humanity's domain expanding across the galaxy under the Emperor's vision. And at the edge of that expansion, aboard the FOTEP, Tony continued his work. The Aegis generators had been approved for fleet-wide deployment after 2 years of successful trials. 0 demon incursions on ships equipped with the technology, measurable improvements in crew survival rates during warp travel, and grudging acknowledgement from Mars that maybe, possibly, under highly controlled circumstances, innovation could serve rather than doom. The psychic enhancement technology remained experimental, but early results suggested it worked. Thousand Suns librarians equipped with Tony's prototype frameworks reported greater control, reduced collateral damage, improved precision in manifesting their abilities. It wasn't perfected yet, might never be perfected, but it was progress. And progress, Tony had learned, was what humanity did when it refused to accept that the past determined the future. He stood in his laboratory, surrounded by devices that merged Imperium technology with principles his Earth had discovered, creating syntheses that belonged to neither universe fully, but served both's needs. JARVIS hummed quietly through armor systems, processing data from experiments that would have been considered heretical 3 years ago, but now were merely supervised. Sir, I'm detecting unusual warp activity, the AI reported. Disturbances that don't match standard patterns. They're concentrated around several Primarch positions simultaneously. Define unusual. Undefined, sir. The patterns suggest coordinated activity, but not from known Xenos or demon sources. It's almost as if the warp itself is being shaped by something vast and deliberate. Tony felt cold certainty settling over him. The Emperor's words came back. Shadows gathering that require attention. Whatever the master of mankind had sensed, whatever he'd been preparing for, it was beginning. Get Magnus, Tony said. Something's happening. Something big. But even as he said it, alarms erupted across the fleet. Vox channels screaming priority alerts. Astropathic messages arriving from across the Imperium in numbers that suggested coordinated catastrophe rather than isolated incident. Magnus appeared in Tony's laboratory minutes later, his expression grim. It's begun, the Primarch said. The event my father feared. Horus, our beloved War Master, has turned against the Emperor. Half the legions are following him into rebellion. Civil war is coming to the Imperium, Tony Stark. Everything we've built, everything we've fought for, is about to be tested in fire. The Horus Heresy, Tony whispered, recognizing history from Magnus's briefings about the Imperium's greatest trauma. Not history, present. We're living it now. Magnus's single eye blazed with psychic intensity. And you, with your innovations and your technology and your refusal to accept limitations, may be exactly what humanity needs to survive what's coming. Or you may be the variable that tips the balance toward extinction. Time will tell. Tony looked at his laboratory, at the devices he'd built, at the technology that represented everything he believed about progress and innovation and humanity's capacity to transcend its limitations. He thought about the Emperor's warning, about the Men of Iron rebellion, about the fine line between advancement and catastrophe. Then he powered up his armor, checked his systems, and prepared for whatever came next. "Let's find out," he said, because that's what engineers did when facing impossible odds. They built something better, pushed boundaries, and refused to let the darkness determine the outcome. The galaxy was burning, civil war was coming, and Tony Stark, genius, billionaire, philanthropist turned interdimensional innovator, was exactly where he needed to be. In the thick of it, building the future, one impossible innovation at a time.